Story 1. The Truck Stop That Loops. Marcus Hayden had been driving long-haul routes for 14 years, primarily running the I-80 corridor between New York and California. On June 6, 2018, he was hauling electronics from Newark to San Francisco, a journey he had made at least 30 times previously. His truck was a 2016 Kenworth T680 with over 450,000 miles on the odometer, reliable and well-maintained. The summer night was warm as Marcus drove through Nebraska, making good time toward his scheduled rest stop in Wyoming. Around 2:30 a.m., Marcus began feeling the fatigue of 16 hours behind the wheel and decided to pull into the next truck stop for his mandatory rest period. A sign appeared announcing services at the upcoming exit, and Marcus took the off-ramp, following the road to a large truck stop that looked familiar, though Marcus couldn't quite place why. The facility was well lit, with dozens of parking spaces for commercial vehicles, a restaurant, showers, and a convenience store, all housed in a sprawling complex. Marcus parked his truck in the commercial lot, grabbed his shower kit and a change of clothes, and walked toward the main building. As he entered, Marcus noticed the interior looked dated, the decor and fixtures appearing to be from the 1980s or early 1990s. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating a slight flicker that was irritating but not unusual for older buildings. The clerk behind the counter was a middle-aged woman with graying hair, her expression blank and tired. Marcus paid for a shower and a hot meal, receiving a token and a number. He walked to the shower facilities, finding them reasonably clean if somewhat worn. The hot water felt amazing after hours on the road, and Marcus took his time, letting the steam and heat relax his muscles. After showering and changing into fresh clothes, Marcus walked to the restaurant area, where his number was called almost immediately. The food was standard truck stop fare, nothing remarkable but adequate. After eating, Marcus returned to his truck, planning to sleep for 8 hours before continuing his journey. He climbed into his sleeper cab, set his alarm, and quickly fell into exhausted sleep. When his alarm woke him, Marcus checked the time. 10:30 a.m., exactly 8 hours after he had set it. Marcus felt rested, his body recovered from the previous day's driving. He started his truck, checked his systems, and prepared to depart the truck stop and continue west toward Wyoming. Marcus pulled out of his parking space and drove toward the exit, following the signs for the westbound on-ramp to Interstate 80. He merged onto the highway and accelerated to cruising speed, his GPS showing the route ahead clearly. After approximately 30 minutes of driving, Marcus saw a sign announcing services at the upcoming exit, the same sign he had seen the previous night. Marcus frowned, confused, thinking perhaps there were multiple truck stops in the area with similar signage. But as Marcus passed the exit without taking it, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The exit number was identical to the one he had taken the previous night, and the truck stop visible from the highway looked exactly the same as the facility he had just left 30 minutes earlier. Marcus checked his GPS, confirming he had driven 30 miles west, that his position was updating correctly, that he was definitely moving forward. Yet somehow he had returned to the same truck stop, the same exit, as if the 30 miles he had driven had looped back on themselves. Marcus grabbed his CB radio and called out to other drivers, asking if anyone else was experiencing strange geography on I-80 in Nebraska. Static answered him initially, then a male voice responded, weary and frightened. "Yeah, I'm seeing it too. I've passed the same truck stop 4 times now. Can't get past it. Every time I drive west for 30 minutes or an hour, I end up back at the same exit. It's like the highway is looping, bringing us back to the starting point no matter how far we drive." Marcus felt panic rising. He was trapped in a loop, driving forward continuously but somehow returning to the same location, unable to progress beyond a certain point. Marcus tried driving faster, pushing his truck to 80 miles per hour, hoping speed would somehow break the loop. He drove for an hour, covering approximately 80 miles according to his odometer, but when he checked his surroundings, the same truck stop appeared ahead, the same exit sign announcing services, the same impossible return to the starting point. Marcus decided to stop, to break the cycle by remaining stationary, hoping that would reset whatever was causing the loop. He took the exit and pulled into the truck stop again, parking in the same commercial lot. The facility looked identical to how it had appeared the previous night. Same lighting, same layout, same dated appearance. Marcus walked into the main building and approached the counter, where the same middle-aged woman stood in the same position, wearing the same expression of blank tiredness. Marcus tried to speak to her, to ask what was happening, to get information about the loop. But when he opened his mouth, no sound emerged. Marcus tried again, forcing air through his vocal cords, attempting to form words, but complete silence was all he could produce. The clerk didn't react to his presence, didn't acknowledge him, just stared straight ahead at nothing. Marcus waved his hand in front of her face, and she didn't blink, didn't move, didn't show any awareness that he existed. Marcus backed away from the counter, his heart pounding, and looked around the truck stop. Other drivers were present, sitting in the restaurant, walking through the convenience store, using the facilities, but they all moved strangely, their motions repetitive and mechanical, like actors performing the same scene over and over. Marcus watched one driver pour coffee, drink it, walk to the trash can, dispose of the cup, then return to the coffee station and repeat the exact sequence, pouring coffee into the same cup that he had just thrown away but that had reappeared on the counter. Marcus ran back to his truck, climbed into the cab, and tried to drive away from the truck stop. But as he approached the exit back to the highway, his truck's steering wheel locked, refusing to turn, forcing him straight toward the westbound on-ramp. Marcus's truck merged onto I-80 heading west against his control, the vehicle driving itself, and Marcus felt the loop beginning again. He would drive for 30 miles or an hour, and then the truck stop would appear, and he would take the exit, and he would park, and he would walk into the building, and the cycle would repeat. Marcus tried to count the loops to keep track of how many times he repeated the sequence, but after the 10th or 12th iteration, his memory began blurring, the loops blending together, making it impossible to distinguish one repetition from another. Marcus wasn't sure if he had been trapped for hours or days or weeks, time having lost meaning in the endless repetition. His body didn't feel hungry or tired, existing in a suspended state where physical needs were absent. During one loop, Marcus noticed something new. Another driver sitting in his truck in the parking lot. The driver's face pressed against the window, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a silent scream. Marcus approached the truck and saw the driver was mouthing words. "Help me. I've been here for years. Can't break the loop. Can't escape. Just driving and stopping and driving and stopping forever." The driver's eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and stretched tight over his skull, his appearance suggesting extreme starvation despite his body still functioning somehow. Marcus tried to communicate, to ask how long the driver had been trapped, but his voice still didn't work, and the other driver couldn't hear him anyway. Just continued mouthing his pleas for help, his silent screams, his desperate attempts to communicate his suffering. Marcus saw other trucks in the lot, some looking old and weathered, some covered in dust and grime, suggesting they had been parked for extended periods, and in each truck was a driver, all silently screaming, all trapped in the loop. Marcus realized with horror that he had joined a collection of drivers caught in this repeating sequence, unable to escape, doomed to drive the same 30 miles or hour and return to the same truck stop forever. The loop was a trap, a pocket of reality that captured travelers and held them in endless repetition, draining something from them with each cycle, feeding on their trapped existence, using them to power the loop itself. Marcus tried everything he could think of to break free. Driving east instead of west, refusing to take the exit, attempting to crash his truck, climbing out of his vehicle while it was moving. But every attempt failed, the loop reasserting control, forcing him back into the sequence. Marcus's truck would drive itself, his body would move against his will, his consciousness trapped in a vehicle and a pattern he couldn't escape. After what felt like months or years of repetition, Marcus began to lose his sense of self, his identity dissolving under the weight of endless loops. He couldn't remember his name clearly, couldn't recall his life before the truck stop, couldn't distinguish his own thoughts from the mechanical pattern of the loop. Marcus was becoming part of the sequence, his consciousness merging with the repetition, his existence becoming the loop itself rather than something trapped within it. Then during one iteration, Marcus saw something different, a crack in the reality of the truck stop, a momentary glitch where the building flickered and showed something else underneath. In that brief glimpse, Marcus saw the truth. The truck stop was a construct, a lure, created by something that fed on trapped travelers, something that built these loops along highways to catch drivers and harvest their chronological energy, their temporal existence, using them to fuel itself by forcing them to repeat time endlessly, creating extra hours and days and years from the loops that it could consume. Marcus understood he was food, was fuel, was a battery powering something ancient and hungry that had learned to trap modern travelers using familiar structures like truck stops. The entity built loops along highways, created familiar exits and services that drivers would naturally stop at, then trapped them in repetition and fed on the temporal energy generated by their endless cycling through the same sequence. Every loop created time that didn't exist elsewhere, borrowed minutes and hours stolen from reality and fed to the entity. Marcus also understood that escape was possible but required sacrifice. The loop could be broken from inside, but only by a driver willing to cease existing, to stop participating in the sequence completely, to become so still and silent and absent that the loop couldn't detect them and would release them as waste. Marcus had to achieve a state of complete non-being while still conscious, had to erase himself from the pattern while maintaining awareness of the erasure. Marcus tried, sitting perfectly still in his truck, stopping all thought, all breath, all movement, all existence except the barest awareness. Marcus sat like that for what felt like eternities, not moving, not thinking, not being, just aware. And slowly the truck stop began to fade. The loop began to weaken. Reality began to reassert itself. Marcus felt the pattern releasing him, unable to maintain its grip on something that had become absence rather than presence. Marcus opened his eyes and found himself on I-80 in Nebraska, driving west. But now the highway continued past, the truck stop exit without looping. Marcus had escaped, had broken free from the repetition, but at a cost. Marcus looked in his mirror and saw that he was translucent, partially erased by his time in the loop, not fully solid anymore. Marcus had escaped but had lost some of his reality in the process, had become less substantial, a ghost of who he had been. Marcus continued driving, completed his delivery to San Francisco, but people had difficulty seeing him, difficulty remembering him after he left their presence. Marcus had become semi-existent, trapped between presence and absence, a driver who had escaped the loop but couldn't fully return to normal reality. Marcus continued working, continued driving long-haul routes, but he was fading, becoming less real with each passing month. The price of breaking the loop being a slow dissolution into complete non-existence. Marcus tried to warn other drivers about the truck stop that loops, posting on forums, speaking at rest areas, but people couldn't hear him clearly, couldn't retain his warnings after he left. Marcus was becoming a ghost, a warning that existed but couldn't be perceived. A driver who had escaped eternal repetition only to face gradual erasure, fading slowly into absence while trying desperately to save others from the trap he had escaped. and the truck stop remained on I-80 in Nebraska, appearing on certain nights at certain times, offering services to weary drivers who would pull off and park and walk inside and begin the loop, joining the collection of trapped drivers who would repeat the same 30 miles and the same truck stop visit forever, unable to escape, fueling the entity that maintained the loop, adding their temporal energy to its feeding, becoming batteries that powered the trap through their endless repetition, driving forever toward a Wyoming they would never reach because the highway looped back before getting there, returning them to the truck stop again and again and again until their consciousness dissolved completely, and they became mindless components of the pattern, mechanical repetitions without awareness, just driving and driving and stopping forever in service to something that fed on trapped time and collected drivers like Marcus, who discovered too late that some truck stops don't offer rest but instead offer eternal repetition disguised as services, luring the tired and the trusting into patterns they cannot break, loops they cannot escape, becoming permanent residents of a truck stop that exists partially outside normal time, creating its own temporal pocket where minutes loop into hours and hours loop into years and years loop into eternities of repetition that feed something ancient and patient and eternally hungry for the chronological energy of travelers who stop seeking rest and find instead imprisonment in the truck stop that loops forever along I-80 in Nebraska, where the exit appears and the services are offered, and the trap springs shut on drivers who pull in seeking sleep and find instead eternal waking repetition. The same sequence forever, driving west to return east, moving forward to arrive backward, progressing to regress, trapped in the loop that Marcus escaped by erasing himself, but that still holds hundreds of others who lack his understanding or his willingness to sacrifice reality itself to break free from the truck stop that loops. Story 2. The Cargo That Whispers. Sandra Martinez had been driving long-haul trucks for 9 years, specializing in refrigerated transport of perishable goods. On September 15, 2020, she was hired for an unusual job: transport a sealed, refrigerated container from a storage facility in Louisiana to a research laboratory in Maine. The pay was exceptional, $5,000 for what should have been a 3-day journey, which immediately suggested something unusual about the cargo. Sandra signed the contracts without reading them carefully, focused on the money rather than the details. The container was loaded onto Sandra's trailer by facility workers wearing full hazmat suits and respirators, which Sandra found concerning but not unprecedented for medical or biological research materials. The container was standard size, 20 feet long, white with no markings except a serial number, and handling instructions that specified maintaining a temperature of exactly 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The facility supervisor handed Sandra a sealed envelope with instructions not to open it unless she experienced specific circumstances detailed on the exterior: sounds from the cargo, visible damage to the container, or temperature fluctuations beyond acceptable range. Sandra departed Louisiana at noon, planning to drive straight through with minimal stops, completing the journey as quickly as possible and collecting her substantial payment. Her truck was a 2019 Freightliner Cascadia with a state-of-the-art refrigeration unit, reliable and capable of maintaining precise temperatures. The drive northeast proceeded normally for the first 12 hours, Sandra making good time through Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and into Georgia. Around midnight, as Sandra drove through rural Georgia on an isolated stretch of highway, she heard something that made her blood run cold: whispering. Soft voices, multiple voices coming from her trailer, emanating from the sealed container. The whispers were too quiet to make out specific words, but they carried an emotional weight of desperation and pleading. Sounds of people begging for something, asking for help or release or mercy. Sandra immediately pulled over, grabbed the sealed envelope, and read the exterior instructions. If sounds are heard from cargo, open this envelope immediately. Sandra tore open the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper with typed instructions. The cargo is experiencing activation. This is normal and does not indicate danger. The sounds you hear are a side effect of the preservation process. Do not open the container under any circumstances. Do not attempt to investigate. Continue driving to the destination. The sounds will intensify but cannot harm you. Maintain focus on driving. Do not listen to what the sounds say. Your payment will be doubled upon successful delivery. Sandra's hands shook as she read the instructions. The cargo was making sounds which meant something alive or semi-alive was in the container. Something that whispered and would intensify its sounds as the journey continued. Sandra considered abandoning the cargo, calling the facility, refusing to continue. But $10,000 instead of $5,000 was a substantial amount, enough to influence her decision. Sandra folded the instructions, returned them to the envelope, and continued driving. The whispers grew louder over the next hour, becoming distinct enough that Sandra could make out words. "Let us out, please. We're so cold. We're trapped. Help us. Open the door. Release us. We'll die in here. Please have mercy." The voices sounded human, male and female, young and old, all begging simultaneously, their pleas overlapping and creating a chorus of desperation that filled Sandra's cab despite originating from the sealed container behind her. Sandra tried to ignore the whispers, turning up her radio to drown them out, but the voices penetrated through the music, through the road noise, through her attempts to block them. The voices weren't just sounds but carried emotional weight that affected Sandra directly, making her feel the desperation and fear and suffering of whatever was in the container. Sandra's hands gripped the steering wheel tight, her jaw clenched, her body tense as she forced herself to keep driving despite every instinct screaming at her to stop and open the container and release whatever was trapped inside. By the time Sandra crossed into South Carolina, the whispers had evolved into full conversations, the voices talking to each other, discussing their situation, sharing their suffering. Sandra heard them describing the cold, the darkness, the cramped space, the hunger, the despair. They talked about their lives before being put in the container, mentioning families and jobs and homes and ordinary details that made them sound human, real, deserving of help. Sandra's resolve began cracking. These were people, real people trapped in her trailer, suffering in refrigerated darkness, and she was transporting them like cargo to some research laboratory that would presumably do terrible things to them. Sandra was complicit in their suffering, was enabling their torture by continuing to drive, by not opening the container and releasing them. The moral weight became unbearable, crushing Sandra's mercenary focus on payment. Then the voices changed tactics, becoming manipulative rather than pleading. One voice, female and young, spoke directly to Sandra by name. "Sandra Martinez, we know who you are. We've seen your thoughts while you've been carrying us. We know you're a good person, that you care about others, that this situation is destroying you. We don't blame you. You didn't know what you were transporting, but now you do know and you have a choice. You can continue driving and deliver us to torment, or you can save us. Open the container, let us out. We'll disappear into the night. No one will ever know. You'll still get paid because you'll report the container was damaged accidentally. Everyone wins except the people who imprisoned us, and they deserve to lose." Sandra wanted desperately to believe the voice, to accept the rationalization that would allow her to open the container with moral justification. But something about the voice's knowledge of her name and her thoughts disturbed Sandra deeply. The cargo wasn't just making sounds, it was somehow reading her mind, accessing her thoughts, using personal information to manipulate her. Whatever was in the container was intelligent and invasive, capable of violating her mental privacy. Sandra called the facility number listed in her instructions, hoping to get guidance or permission to abandon the cargo. The phone rang 15 times before a male voice answered, cold and professional. Ms. Martinez, we've been monitoring your cargo. The activation is proceeding normally. The sounds you're hearing are designed to manipulate you into opening the container. Do not open it under any circumstances. What's inside is not human, despite sounding human. It's a collection of neural tissue samples preserved in specialized medium, capable of generating sounds and limited telepathic projection, but not conscious in any meaningful sense. You're hearing the cargo's attempts to escape confinement by manipulating your empathy. Continue driving. Your doubled payment is confirmed upon delivery. Sandra asked the obvious question. If it's just tissue samples, why can it speak? Why does it know my name? Why can it read my thoughts? The response was clinical and disturbing. The tissue samples retain some functions of their original sources: pattern recognition, memory access, emotional manipulation. But they're not alive in the way you understand life. They're biological computers running programs designed to break containment. Ignore their output, deliver the cargo, collect your payment. The call ended, leaving Sandra with an impossible decision. Believe the facility's explanation that the voices were just biological computers, or believe the voices that claimed to be suffering prisoners. Sandra didn't know which version was true, couldn't determine if opening the container would free innocent people or release something dangerous that had learned to mimic human speech perfectly. The uncertainty was its own torture, forcing Sandra to make a choice without adequate information, holding her morally responsible regardless of which option she chose. Sandra decided to trust the facility, to continue driving, to deliver the cargo and accept that sometimes the right choice looked terrible from the inside. The voices raged at her decision, screaming accusations, calling her complicit, describing the torments they would endure because of her choice. The voices shared detailed descriptions of experiments that would be performed on them, procedures that sounded like medieval torture adapted to modern laboratories, suffering that would continue for years because the refrigeration kept them preserved and aware. Sandra drove through the accusations and descriptions, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with emotional trauma. But she didn't stop. Sandra continued through South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, the voices in her trailer never ceasing, never quieting, maintaining constant pressure designed to break her resolve. By the time Sandra reached Maryland, she was hallucinating, seeing faces in her mirrors, feeling hands grabbing at her arms, experiencing psychological breaks from the sustained mental assault. Sandra pulled into a rest area and tried to sleep, but the voices penetrated her sleep, filling her dreams with images of the cargo's suffering, forcing her to experience their perspective, to feel the cold and the darkness and the trapped horror of existence in the container. Sandra woke screaming, unable to separate dream from reality, unsure if what she was experiencing was genuine or manufactured by the telepathic cargo. Sandra called the facility again, begging them to send someone else to complete the delivery, to take the cargo from her before she completely broke, but the response was firm. Ms. Martinez, you're 1 day from delivery. The cargo has almost exhausted its ability to project. The voices will diminish soon. Complete the delivery. Your payment will be tripled to $15,000. Just drive for 24 more hours. Sandra continued, motivated now not by money but by stubbornness, by refusal to let the cargo defeat her, by determination to prove she could withstand the assault. The voices sensed her resolve and changed tactics again, becoming seductive, promising rewards if she opened the container. Sandra, we can give you anything. We have knowledge from our original sources, information that's valuable. Open the container and we'll share it. Stock tips, lottery numbers, secrets about people you know. We can make you rich beyond the pittance they're paying you. Just open the door. Sandra ignored the offers, recognizing them as desperate attempts to find any lever that might work. The cargo was trying everything: sympathy, guilt, bribery, threats, any psychological approach that might convince Sandra to break the seal. But Sandra had committed to delivery, had decided to see this through regardless of the cost to her sanity or morality. Finally, after 36 hours of continuous driving broken only by mandatory rest stops where she couldn't actually rest, Sandra reached the laboratory in Maine. She backed her trailer to the loading dock, and technicians in hazmat suits immediately swarmed the container, securing it and preparing to move it into the facility. The voices in Sandra's trailer screamed one final time, a chorus of rage and despair, then went silent as the container was disconnected from her refrigeration unit. Sandra collected her payment, $15,000 as promised, but the money felt meaningless. Blood money paid for transporting something that had begged for mercy while she ignored its pleas. Sandra tried to learn what the cargo actually was, researching the laboratory and the facility that had hired her, but both were shell companies with no public information. Sandra never discovered if she had transported suffering tissue samples or imprisoned consciousness or something else entirely. Sandra quit long-haul trucking 3 weeks later, unable to drive without hearing whispers, unable to pull a trailer without wondering if it contained cargo that would speak to her, unable to trust that any load was truly inanimate. Sandra's final act as a trucker was to write a detailed account of the whispering cargo and post it on forums and websites, warning other drivers to refuse jobs that paid unusually well for refrigerated transport of sealed containers, to avoid becoming complicit in whatever industry existed that created cargo that whispered and pleaded and screamed. But the warnings were largely ignored, dismissed as fiction or psychological breakdown, and the refrigerated containers continued to be transported, their sealed contents whispering to drivers who mostly didn't hear or mostly ignored what they heard, delivering their mysterious cargo to laboratories and facilities that conducted research on materials that existed in the gray area between alive and dead, conscious and unconscious, human and inhuman. And the whispers continued, floating from trailers on highways across the country, saying things drivers tried not to hear, making claims drivers couldn't verify, suffering in refrigerated darkness while being transported to destinations where their suffering would be studied and utilized and extended indefinitely, all while drivers like Sandra collected payment for delivering cargo they couldn't identify and couldn't save and couldn't forget. Whispers that would haunt them forever. Voices that would echo in their memories long after the trailers were empty, reminding them that sometimes you can't know if you're doing the right thing, that sometimes you have to choose between bad options, that sometimes the cargo you haul carries more than freight and less than nothing, existing in states that defy understanding, whispering truths or lies that sound identical, crying out for help that may or may not be deserved, trapped in containers that cross the country on trailers pulled by drivers who hear but don't listen, who know but don't act, who suspect but don't confirm, delivering whispers to destinations where whispers are harvested, studied, used, and silenced. Finally, after years or decades of crying out during transport, riding in refrigerated containers on trucks driven by people who need the money more than they need the moral certainty, who accept payment for ignoring pleas, who become complicit through inaction, who joined Sandra in the fraternity of drivers who hauled cargo that whispered and wished forever after that they had made different choices, had opened the containers, had released whatever was inside regardless of consequences, but didn't and never could undo that decision, could never unhear the whispers, could never escape the knowledge that they had transported suffering and delivered it to places where suffering was the product being purchased, where whispers were the resources being harvested, where whatever existed in refrigerated containers would spend eternity screaming in temperatures that preserved them perfectly for endless torment that served purposes Sandra would never understand and could never justify, but had enabled through her choice to drive rather than stop, to deliver rather than refuse, to prioritize payment over whatever morality demanded, becoming another driver who heard the cargo whisper and chose to ignore it, continuing the transport, completing the delivery, collecting the money, and living afterward with whispers echoing forever in her memory. Story 3. The Road That Never Ends. Thomas Reed had been a long-haul trucker for 23 years, running routes across the American Southwest. On October 10, 2016, he was hauling industrial piping from Phoenix to Albuquerque, a relatively straightforward 10-hour drive across Arizona and into New Mexico. His truck was a 2014 Peterbilt 579 with 620,000 miles on the odometer, nearing the end of its useful life but still functional. The autumn day was hot, temperature in the low 90s with clear skies and excellent visibility across the desert landscape. Thomas departed Phoenix at 6:01 a.m., planning to reach Albuquerque by mid-afternoon, deliver his cargo, and head back toward Phoenix the following morning. The route was Interstate 40 East, a highway Thomas had driven hundreds of times, familiar and unremarkable. The drive proceeded normally through Arizona, Thomas maintaining 68 miles per hour, listening to country music, staying alert and comfortable. As Thomas crossed into New Mexico around noon, he noticed his fuel gauge was lower than expected, showing he had consumed more diesel than the distance traveled should have required. Thomas attributed it to headwinds or perhaps a fuel gauge error, but he decided to refuel at the next truck stop to be safe. According to his GPS, there was a truck stop approximately 40 miles ahead at an exit that Thomas had used many times before. Thomas drove the 40 miles, his odometer advancing appropriately, his GPS showing his position updating normally. But when he reached the location where the truck stop should have been, there was no exit, no services, no truck stop. The highway continued straight through empty desert, no signs of the infrastructure that Thomas distinctly remembered from previous trips. Thomas checked his GPS again, confirming he was at the correct mile marker, at the location where the exit should exist. But the exit didn't exist. Thomas continued driving, thinking perhaps he had misremembered the location, that the truck stop was further ahead. Another 40 miles passed, approximately another hour of driving, and again no exit appeared where Thomas's GPS insisted there should be services. The highway continued endlessly through unchanging desert, no exits, no variations, just straight pavement extending to the horizon. Thomas's fuel gauge was approaching empty now, having consumed fuel appropriate for approximately 140 miles of driving, despite Thomas having driven what should have been only 80 miles since crossing into New Mexico. The mathematics didn't work. Either Thomas's odometer was malfunctioning or the distance between locations had increased somehow, or something else was affecting his journey in ways Thomas couldn't understand. Thomas tried his CB radio, calling for any other drivers in the area, asking if anyone else was experiencing issues with exits or distances on Interstate 40 in New Mexico. Static answered him initially, then a voice responded, male and panicked. "I've been driving this highway for 16 hours. It never ends. No exits, no towns, no services, just highway forever. My fuel ran out 2 hours ago, but my truck keeps running. I can't stop. The truck drives itself when I try to pull over. We're trapped on the road that never ends." Thomas felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. Another driver was trapped on what sounded like the same highway, experiencing the same endless road, the same impossible distances, the same inability to stop. Thomas tried to respond, to ask where the other driver was, but the connection dissolved into static, leaving Thomas alone again with just the unchanging desert and the straight highway. Thomas's truck began running rough, the engine sputtering despite the fuel gauge showing empty, the vehicle operating on no apparent fuel source. Thomas tried to pull over, intending to stop and investigate, but his steering wheel wouldn't turn toward the shoulder. The truck maintained its course, staying centered in the right lane, driving itself at a steady 68 miles per hour regardless of Thomas's input. Thomas tried the brakes, but the pedal was unresponsive, not connecting to the braking system at all. Thomas was a passenger in his own truck, the vehicle operating independently, driving the endless highway through unchanging desert. Thomas tried to open his door, thinking he would jump from the moving truck, but the door wouldn't budge, locked or jammed, or simply refusing to open. Thomas was trapped in his cab, being carried forward by a truck that ran without fuel and drove without input, following a highway that had no exits and no destinations. Hours passed, maybe 6 or 8, Thomas losing track of time as the sun slowly moved across the sky. The desert remained identical, the same rocks and sand and scrub vegetation repeating infinitely, as if Thomas was driving through a looping landscape that recycled the same environment endlessly. Thomas's odometer continued advancing, showing he had driven over 400 miles since entering New Mexico, but his GPS showed his position as frozen at the same mile marker where the exits had first disappeared. Thomas tried to sleep, hoping unconsciousness would provide relief from the psychological torture of endless driving, but sleep wouldn't come. Thomas remained alert and aware despite hours without rest, his body apparently refusing to shut down, forced to witness every mile of the endless highway. Thomas began to understand he was being punished, though he couldn't identify his crime or his judge or his sentence's duration. Night fell, but instead of stars, the sky above Thomas showed nothing, complete blackness without any celestial features, as if the highway existed in a void separate from normal reality. Thomas's headlights illuminated the road ahead, showing the same straight pavement extending forever, never curving, never rising or falling, just flat and straight and endless. Then Thomas saw something ahead that made his remaining sanity fracture. His own truck, or a truck identical to his, driving in the same lane approximately 1 mile ahead. Thomas watched his apparent doppelganger maintaining exactly the same speed as Thomas, keeping the distance constant. Thomas tried to accelerate to catch up, but his truck wouldn't increase speed. He tried to slow down to increase separation, but his truck maintained its 68 miles per hour regardless of his efforts. Thomas was following himself, or another driver in an identical situation, both trapped on the endless highway, both driving forever without progress or destination. Thomas wondered if this was his fate, to drive until his body failed, to remain trapped on the road that never ends, to become another ghost truck that future drivers would see ahead of them, proof that others had been caught before and would remain caught forever. Then Thomas noticed something else. His own truck was also behind him, visible in his mirrors approximately 1 mile back, maintaining the same speed and distance. Thomas was sandwiched between versions of himself or other trapped drivers, part of a convoy of infinite trucks, all driving the endless highway, all separated by exactly 1 mile, all trapped in the same eternal journey. Thomas screamed, his voice filling the cab but producing no echo, absorbed by the artificial environment of the road that never ends. Thomas beat on his windows, trying to break them, but the glass was unbreakable, refusing to crack or shatter. Thomas was sealed in his cab, surrounded by copies of himself, driving through a void that pretended to be a highway in New Mexico, but was actually something else. Something hungry that collected drivers and kept them moving forever, creating a fleet of trapped travelers who would never stop, never arrive, never escape. Thomas's last coherent thought before his mind broke completely was a realization. He had died. He had died crossing into New Mexico, maybe a heart attack or a crash or simply a transition he hadn't noticed. And this endless highway was his afterlife, his punishment, or perhaps just his fate as a driver who had spent his life on roads and would spend his death on one as well. Driving eternally through emptiness, following himself, being followed by himself, part of an infinite convoy on the road that never ends. And Thomas Reed drives still, his truck visible sometimes to living drivers who cross into New Mexico on Interstate 40, a ghost truck maintaining 68 miles per hour, exactly 1 mile ahead or 1 mile behind. Part of the endless convoy of trapped drivers who discovered too late that some highways don't connect locations, but instead loop through voids, collecting travelers who enter at wrong times or wrong angles or wrong states of being, adding them to fleets that drive forever through changing landscape, part of eternal journeys that have no beginnings or destinations, just middle sections that extend infinitely, roads that never end because they never actually go anywhere, just create the illusion of travel while maintaining stasis, keeping drivers trapped in motion without progress, driving their trucks on fuel that doesn't exist toward exits that never appear. Surrounded by copies of themselves or other trapped drivers, all part of the same convoy, all sharing the same fate, all driving the road that never ends through deserts that loop and skies that show nothing and fuel gauges that read empty but engines that never stop and steering wheels that don't respond and doors that won't open and highways that continue forever and ever and ever, collecting more drivers every year, adding to the convoy that grows longer with each traveler who enters New Mexico at the wrong moment and discovers too late that the highway they're driving doesn't actually exist in normal space, but instead exists in a pocket dimension created for collecting drivers and keeping them moving, using them to power the road itself perhaps, or simply keeping them as specimens or punishing them for unknowable crimes, or maintaining them for purposes no living human understands, creating populations of eternal drivers who will never stop, never rest, never arrive, just drive forever on the road that Thomas discovered and joined and remains trapped on, somewhere between mile markers that don't change and exits that don't exist, driving past himself every hour, seeing his own truck ahead and behind, knowing he's part of an infinite loop of trapped travelers who made the mistake of crossing into New Mexico on October 10th, 2016, or October 10th of any year, the calendar date that opens the road that never ends, allowing drivers to slip through into the void highway where they will remain forever, driving endlessly, timelessly, hopelessly, eternally on Interstate 40 that isn't actually Interstate 40 but rather a copy or a parody or a hell dimension shaped like a highway, existing to trap and hold and keep drivers moving forever through emptiness disguised as desert, through void dressed as sky, through eternity marketed as a 10-hour drive to Albuquerque that never completes, never ends, never releases those who enter, collecting souls one truck at a time, building convoys that span infinite miles of highway that fits inside impossible spaces. Roads that never end existing forever in dimensions adjacent to, but separate from the America that living drivers cross. Parallel highways where the dead or the trapped or the cursed drive eternally without rest or purpose or hope of escape, just driving because driving is what they know and all they can do and will continue doing forever on roads that never end. Story 4. The Hitchhiker Who Follows. David Nguyen had been a long-haul trucker for 16 years, primarily running routes through the Pacific Northwest. On April 3, 2019, he was hauling lumber from Seattle to Portland, a short 3-hour drive down Interstate 5. His truck was a 2017 Volvo VNL 780 with excellent safety ratings and modern amenities. The spring afternoon was rainy, typical for the region with moderate traffic and good visibility despite the precipitation. David was making the return leg of a delivery run, his trailer empty, planning to pick up another load in Portland before heading back north. About an hour south of Seattle, David saw a figure standing on the shoulder of the highway, thumb extended in the universal hitchhiking gesture. The figure was male, appearing to be in his 30s, wearing a dark jacket and jeans that were soaked from the rain. David's policy was never to pick up hitchhikers, both company regulation and personal safety practice. So he continued past without slowing. In his side mirror, David saw the hitchhiker turn to watch his truck pass, the man's face expressionless and pale in the gray afternoon light. 10 minutes later, David saw the same hitchhiker ahead, standing on the shoulder in the exact same position, thumb extended, wearing the same soaked clothing. David frowned, confused about how the hitchhiker could have gotten ahead of him. David had been driving 65 miles per hour continuously, had passed no exits where the hitchhiker could have taken a shortcut. Yet here the man stood approximately 10 miles ahead of where David had first seen him. David passed the hitchhiker again, this time watching carefully in his mirrors to see if he could understand the mechanism of the man's impossible movement. The hitchhiker didn't move after David passed, just stood watching the truck recede, his expression still blank and emotionless. David tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe there were two hitchhikers, twins or similar-looking men wearing identical clothing, both trying to catch rides on the same stretch of highway. It seemed improbable but less impossible than a single hitchhiker teleporting ahead of moving traffic. Another 10 minutes passed and David saw the hitchhiker ahead again, same position, same posture, same soaked clothing. David's hands tightened on the wheel as he processed the impossibility. This was definitely the same person appearing repeatedly ahead of David's truck despite no means of traveling faster than David was driving. David grabbed his CB radio and called out, asking if other drivers were seeing the hitchhiker on Interstate 5 southbound. A female voice responded immediately, tense and frightened. "Yeah, I'm seeing him too. I've passed him 5 times now. He keeps appearing ahead. Every time I pass him, he shows up again 10 minutes later. I don't know what he is, but he's not human. Humans can't do what he's doing. I'm getting off at the next exit. I'm not driving past him again." David understood her fear, felt it himself, but curiosity overrode his caution. David wanted to understand what was happening, wanted to solve the mystery rather than flee from it. David passed the hitchhiker a 4th time, and this time, as David's truck drew alongside, the hitchhiker turned his head to look directly at David. Their eyes met for just a moment through the rain-streaked windows, and David saw something in the hitchhiker's expression that froze his blood: recognition and hunger. The hitchhiker knew David, knew he had passed multiple times, and the hitchhiker wanted something from David specifically. David accelerated, pushing his truck to 75 miles per hour, wanting to put distance between himself and the impossible hitchhiker. But 12 minutes later, exactly the time it should take to travel 10 miles at 75 miles per hour, the hitchhiker appeared ahead again. The appearances weren't random or arbitrary, but precisely calculated, the hitchhiker positioning himself exactly 10 miles ahead of David's current location with perfect timing. David decided to test something. He slowed to 45 miles per hour, reducing his speed significantly. If the hitchhiker was appearing based on time rather than distance, the interval should remain consistent. But if the appearances were distance-based, the interval should increase. David drove at 45 miles per hour, watching his odometer carefully. After traveling exactly 10 miles, which took approximately 13 minutes at the reduced speed, the hitchhiker appeared ahead right, on schedule, distance-based, David concluded. The hitchhiker was appearing every 10 miles regardless of how long it took David to travel that distance. This suggested the hitchhiker existed in multiple locations simultaneously, or was moving in ways that ignored normal physics, appearing at predetermined points along the highway to intersect with David's journey. David tried changing lanes, moving from the right lane to the left lane, thinking perhaps the hitchhiker was confined to the shoulder and right lane. But when David's truck reached the 10-mile mark, the hitchhiker was standing in the median on the left side of the highway, thumb extended toward David's left lane position. The hitchhiker was adapting, changing position to match David's choices, maintaining the pattern regardless of David's evasive maneuvers. David took the next exit, deciding to leave Interstate 5 and take surface streets to Portland, hoping that breaking the highway pattern would end the appearances. David followed the exit ramp into a small town, turning onto local roads that would eventually connect to Portland through slower but more varied routes. David felt relief as he drove through the town, seeing normal traffic and pedestrians escaping the isolated highway where the hitchhiker had manifested. David drove through residential areas, past schools and parks, following his GPS toward Portland on roads he rarely used. After approximately 10 miles of surface street driving, David turned a corner and saw the hitchhiker standing on the sidewalk ahead, thumb extended, waiting for David. The pattern had followed David off the highway, had adapted to surface streets, maintaining its 10-mile interval regardless of the route David chose. David's relief turned to despair. He couldn't escape through navigation, couldn't break the pattern by changing roads or directions. The hitchhiker was locked onto David somehow, appearing every 10 miles no matter where David drove, following him with supernatural persistence. David wondered what would happen if he stopped, if he refused to drive the next 10-mile interval. Would the hitchhiker remain at his current position, or would he approach David's stationary truck? David didn't want to find out. He continued driving, passing the hitchhiker for what must have been the 20th or 30th time, the appearances blending together into a repeating nightmare. Each time David passed, the hitchhiker's expression became more intense, the hunger in his eyes more pronounced, the wanting more obvious. The hitchhiker needed something from David, was trying to communicate or compel, or simply waiting for David to understand what was required. Then during one appearance, David noticed something new. The hitchhiker's hand, the one extended with thumb out, was pointing not just upward but specifically toward David's passenger door. The gesture was an invitation, a request, a demand. The hitchhiker wanted to be picked up, wanted entry into David's truck, wanted David to stop and open the passenger door and allow him inside. David refused driving past, but now he understood what the pattern was building toward. Each appearance was increasing pressure, creating psychological wear, making David more likely to eventually give in and stop, just to end the repetition, to break the pattern, to satisfy the hitchhiker's apparent need. David was being worn down through repetition, his resistance eroding with each 10-mile interval, his sanity fracturing under the weight of impossible appearances. David's CB radio crackled to life, a voice speaking that sounded exactly like David's own voice, but the words weren't David's. "Stop and pick me up. You know you want to. You're curious. You need to understand. And I need a ride. I've been waiting so long. Waiting for someone like you, someone who won't run away, someone who keeps driving, someone who gives me enough appearances to build the bridge. Stop at the next appearance. Open your door. Let me in. I'll explain everything. I'll tell you why I'm here and what I need and how you can help. Just stop. Just open the door. Just let me in." David turned off his CB radio, cutting off his own voice, speaking words he hadn't said. The hitchhiker was getting inside David's head, using his voice, preparing for the moment when David's resistance would break and he would stop and open the door, allowing the hitchhiker to enter the truck. David knew with absolute certainty that if he let the hitchhiker inside, something terrible would happen, something irreversible, something that would change David fundamentally. But David was tiring, his mental defenses weakening. He had been driving for over 3 hours, had passed the hitchhiker dozens of times, had covered nearly 200 miles of highway and surface streets, and Portland was finally visible ahead. David just needed to reach his destination, to complete the journey, to end this nightmare. But even as David saw the Portland city limits, the hitchhiker appeared ahead one more time, standing at the side of the road leading into the city, waiting for David. David made a desperate decision. He grabbed his cell phone and called 911, reporting that a suspicious person was repeatedly appearing on roadways following his truck, possibly indicating a stalker or someone with malicious intent. The dispatcher took his report seriously, promised to send police to investigate, asked David to describe the hitchhiker and provide his current location. David gave all the information, hoping that official intervention would somehow break the pattern, would remove the hitchhiker through normal law enforcement procedures. But even as David was on the phone with the dispatcher, he drove past the hitchhiker's position and continued toward Portland. 10 miles later, as David entered the Portland city limits proper, the hitchhiker appeared ahead again, this time standing directly in David's lane, not on the shoulder but in the middle of the road, forcing David to either stop or swerve. David swerved, his truck moving into the left lane to avoid collision, his heart pounding as he passed within feet of the hitchhiker who stood immobile in the lane, watching David pass with those hungry eyes. David reached his destination, a lumber yard on Portland's industrial edge, and backed his empty trailer into the loading dock. Workers immediately began preparing the next load, but David sat in his cab, shaking, unable to exit his truck because he knew what would happen. The hitchhiker would appear again 10 miles from David's current location, or perhaps adapting to the fact that David had stopped, appearing at the lumber yard itself, manifesting wherever David went because the pattern was locked on and wouldn't release until David satisfied whatever requirement the hitchhiker represented. David forced himself to exit the truck, to walk toward the lumberyard office to complete his paperwork. As David crossed the parking lot, he saw the hitchhiker standing at the entrance to the facility, thumb extended, waiting for David to pass within 10 feet, close enough that David could see the hitchhiker's features clearly, could see that his skin was gray and slightly translucent, that his eyes were completely black with no whites visible, that his clothing wasn't just wet but was rotting, deteriorating, showing signs of decomposition. The hitchhiker wasn't alive, David realized, had never been alive, at least not recently. The hitchhiker was dead, or had been dead, or existed in a state between life and death, manifesting on highways to catch rides from drivers who would stop and open their doors and let death itself climb into the passenger seat. David had been dodging death for hours, refusing the invitation, denying the hitchhiker's request for entry, and now death stood at the entrance to the lumberyard waiting for David to approach. David stopped walking, standing in the middle of the parking lot, refusing to move closer to the hitchhiker. The two remained in a standoff for several minutes, David frozen in place and the hitchhiker waiting by the entrance, until finally one of the lumberyard workers approached David and asked if he was okay. David pointed toward the entrance, asking if the worker could see the hitchhiker standing there. The worker looked, saw nothing, confirmed that the entrance was clear and no one was standing there. David looked again and saw the hitchhiker was gone, vanished, no longer visible. David cautiously approached the entrance and walked into the office, completing his paperwork with hands that shook so badly he could barely sign his name. The clerk asked if David needed medical attention, noting his pale complexion and evident distress, but David declined, insisting he was just tired from the drive. David returned to his truck, received his new load assignment, and prepared to depart the lumberyard. As David drove out of the facility, he checked his mirrors compulsively, looking for the hitchhiker, expecting him to appear standing on the side of the exit road. But the hitchhiker didn't manifest, didn't appear in David's mirrors or ahead on the road. David had somehow broken free from the pattern, had escaped the 10-mile repetitions by reaching his destination and stopping, by refusing to continue driving in the pattern that fed the hitchhiker's appearances. David completed his new delivery without incident, but he never drove that stretch of Interstate 5 between Seattle and Portland again, always routing around it, adding hours to his journeys to avoid the location where the hitchhiker had first appeared. David researched the highway, looking for reports of other drivers experiencing similar phenomena, and found scattered accounts on forums and trucker websites, stories of hitchhikers who appeared repeatedly, who followed drivers using supernatural means, who wanted entry into vehicles for purposes that were never fully explained but always understood to be malevolent. David learned that the hitchhiker phenomenon was well known in certain trucker communities, considered an occupational hazard of long-haul driving, a supernatural entity or category of entities that manifested on highways and attempted to catch rides from the living. The common advice was simple: never stop, never open your door, never let the hitchhiker inside no matter how many times he appears or how worn down you become. Because drivers who stopped and opened their doors were never seen again. Their trucks found abandoned on roadsides with no sign of the drivers, no evidence of where they went or what happened after they let death into their passenger seats. And the hitchhiker continued appearing on Interstate 5, standing on shoulders and medians, thumb extended, waiting for drivers who would stop, who would break the cardinal rule, who would open their doors and invite death inside, joining the collection of missing drivers who had made that fatal mistake, who had been worn down by repetition until resistance broke and curiosity or exhaustion or simple desperation made them pull over and reach across to unlock the passenger door and say, "Get in," to the figure who had been following them, appearing every 10 miles, building pressure through persistence, waiting with infinite patience for the moment when the driver would finally stop and the hitchhiker could finally complete his purpose, climbing into the passenger seat with his rotting clothes and his black eyes and his gray translucent skin, settling into the cab with the smell of death and decay, turning to face the driver with recognition and hunger and satisfaction that finally someone had stopped, someone had opened the door, someone had let him in, allowing death to ride as a passenger, to share the cab, to accompany the driver to destinations that existed beyond the roads humans knew, taking them to places where other drivers had gone before, building a collection of those who stopped and those who opened doors and those who learned too late that some hitchhikers should never be picked up, that some invitations should never be accepted, that some patterns should be broken by escape rather than by completion, that the hitchhiker who follows will follow forever if you keep driving but will claim you immediately if you stop, creating an impossible choice between endless repetition and fatal acceptance, between driving past death infinitely or inviting death inside once, between exhaustion that never ends or relief that ends everything. The choice that David made by refusing to stop, by driving to his destination despite the hitchhiker's appearances, by breaking the pattern through completion rather than surrender, escaping the hitchhiker who followed by reaching a place where the pattern couldn't continue, where stopping was required for purposes other than accepting death, where David could exit his truck and refuse to approach the figure standing at the entrance, waiting with patience that had waited for other drivers and would wait for future drivers, appearing every 10 miles on highways where the lonely travel and the exhausted drive and the curious wonder what would happen if they just stopped once, just pulled over once, just opened the door once to the hitchhiker who follows, who waits, who appears, who wants entry, who needs riders, who collects drivers one truck at a time on highways that stretch across America where death hitchhikes patiently, thumb extended, appearing every 10 miles to drivers who catch his attention, who meet his eyes, who acknowledge his presence, who become targets of his following, his appearing, his waiting, his invitation to stop and open doors and accept death as a passenger on journeys that will end. Not at destinations on maps, but at places where the missing go, where the disappeared reside, where drivers who stopped for hitchhikers arrive and remain forever, collected by death who rides in passenger seats, who follows those who drive, who appears every 10 miles until the pattern breaks or the driver breaks and death finally gets his ride. Story 5. The Way Station That Judges. Elizabeth Park had been a long-haul trucker for 12 years, specializing in oversized load transport requiring special permits and route planning. On November 8, 2021, she was hauling industrial equipment from Detroit to Dallas, driving a specialized heavy-haul truck configured for loads exceeding standard weight limits. Her route required stopping at way stations for inspection and documentation, standard procedure for oversized loads that Elizabeth had performed hundreds of times without incident. Around 3 p.m., Elizabeth approached a way station in southern Illinois, the electronic sign indicating all trucks must enter. Elizabeth activated her turn signal and guided her heavy-haul truck down the entrance ramp, joining the short line of commercial vehicles waiting for inspection. The facility appeared normal, standard government design with inspection bays, scales, and an office building where documentation was processed. Elizabeth's truck rolled onto the scales and she waited for the weight reading to display. The digital screen flickered, then showed not a weight in pounds or tons, but a different number entirely. 847. Elizabeth frowned, confused by the reading. She radioed the scale operator, asking for clarification about what the number represented. The response came through her CB radio, a female voice that sounded tired and mechanical. "Your load weighs 847. Please proceed to Inspection Bay 3 for processing." Elizabeth tried to ask what units the 847 represented, but the operator didn't respond to follow-up questions. Elizabeth drove off the scales toward Inspection Bay 3, where a uniformed inspector waited with a clipboard. The inspector was male, middle-aged, with features that seemed slightly wrong, proportions that were almost human but subtly off in ways Elizabeth couldn't immediately identify. The inspector approached Elizabeth's cab and gestured for her to lower her window. "Ms. Park, your load weighs 847. This exceeds the allowable limit of 500. You'll need to offload 347 units before you can proceed." The inspector's voice was flat, emotionless, and his eyes were gray and unfocused, looking past Elizabeth rather than at her. Elizabeth tried to explain that her load was industrial equipment, that weight was measured in tons, not in the units he was referencing, that she had all proper permits and documentation for oversized transport. But the inspector shook his head, consulting his clipboard. "Your load weighs 847 units, specifically 234 units of anger, 189 units of regret, 156 units of guilt, 142 units of fear, and 126 units of shame. Total 847 units of emotional weight, far exceeding the allowable limit of 500. You must offload 347 units to proceed. Failure to comply will result in permanent detention at this facility." Elizabeth's mind struggled to process what the inspector was saying. The weigh station wasn't measuring physical weight but emotional weight, quantifying feelings and psychological burdens, determining that Elizabeth was carrying too much emotional cargo and needed to reduce it before continuing her journey. The absurdity was overwhelming, but the inspector's serious expression and official demeanor suggested this was somehow legitimate, a real requirement Elizabeth needed to satisfy. Elizabeth tried to argue, to insist this was impossible, that emotions couldn't be weighed or offloaded, that she needed to continue her delivery. But the inspector was unmoved. "All trucks are weighed at this station, physical weight and emotional weight. You passed the physical inspection but failed the emotional inspection. You cannot proceed until your emotional weight is reduced to acceptable limits. Please park in detention area 2 and begin offloading process." The inspector walked away before Elizabeth could continue arguing, leaving her sitting in her truck at Inspection Bay 3, surrounded by other vehicles that were apparently passing through normally. Elizabeth looked around and noticed that most of the trucks were being waved through quickly, their drivers showing relief as they exited the weigh station. But a few trucks, maybe 1 in 10, were being directed to detention areas, their drivers looking confused and frightened as they parked in designated spaces and waited for instructions on how to offload emotional weight. Elizabeth decided to refuse to simply drive through the weigh station without complying, to return to the highway and continue her delivery. But as Elizabeth put her truck in gear and tried to drive toward the exit, her vehicle wouldn't respond. The engine ran, the transmission engaged, but the truck didn't move, wheels locked in place by some mechanism Elizabeth couldn't identify. She tried backing up, tried turning, tried any direction of movement, but the truck was frozen in position, held by the weigh station until Elizabeth complied with the inspector's demands. Elizabeth climbed down from her truck and walked toward the office building, intending to file a complaint or demand to speak with a supervisor. Inside the building, Elizabeth found a waiting area filled with other drivers, maybe 20 or 30 people, all looking exhausted and defeated. An older man sitting near the entrance saw Elizabeth's confused expression and gestured for her to sit beside him. "First time at the judgment station?" the old man asked, his voice weary. "Yeah, it's real. It weighs your soul, measures your emotional burdens, determines if you're carrying too much psychological weight. If you fail the inspection, you're stuck here until you offload enough to meet the limit. Some people offload quickly, deal with their shit, and leave within hours. Others are stuck for days, weeks, even months. I've been here 11 days. Can't seem to get below the 500 limit. Every time I think I've processed something, confronted some old guilt, or forgiven some past mistake, they weigh me again, and I'm still over." Elizabeth sat down heavily, her legs weak with the realization that she was truly trapped, imprisoned at a weigh station that measured something unmeasurable and demanded satisfaction of requirements that defied normal logic. Elizabeth asked how she was supposed to offload emotional weight, what process was required. The old man gestured toward a hallway leading from the waiting area. "Confession booths. You go in. You confront your heaviest emotions, you process them, you release them if you can. Some people cry, some people scream, some people just sit in silence for hours, working through shit they've been carrying for decades. When you think you've offloaded enough, you come out and get weighed again. If you're under 500, you can leave. If you're still over, you go back in and keep working. There's no shortcut, no way to cheat. The station knows your real weight, measures what you're actually carrying, regardless of what you claim or pretend." Elizabeth walked down the hallway, finding a row of small rooms, each containing a chair and nothing else. No mirrors, no religious iconography, no therapeutic equipment, just an empty room with a chair where drivers sat and confronted themselves. Elizabeth chose a room, entered, and sat in the chair. The door closed behind her, and Elizabeth was alone in complete silence, isolated with her thoughts and feelings and memories. Elizabeth tried to think about what the inspector had listed: anger, regret, guilt, fear, shame. What was she carrying in those categories? Elizabeth thought about her ex-husband, the divorce 12 years earlier that had been bitter and destructive, the anger she still felt about his infidelity and lies. She thought about her daughter, who she hadn't spoken to in 5 years after a fight about Elizabeth's career choice, the regret that she hadn't tried harder to reconcile. She thought about the accident 7 years ago when she had been driving tired and had drifted into another lane, causing a collision that injured 2 people, the guilt that she carried despite the other driver's insurance accepting fault. Elizabeth sat in the chair and cried, really cried, letting out tears she had been holding for years, releasing grief and pain and disappointment that she had buried under the demands of driving and working and surviving. Elizabeth cried for hours, her body shaking with the release, her throat raw from sobbing, her face wet and swollen. When she had no more tears left, Elizabeth sat in silence, feeling emptier and lighter, wondering if this constituted sufficient offloading. Elizabeth emerged from the confession room and returned to the waiting area where the old man still sat. "Go get weighed again," he suggested. "See if you dropped enough." Elizabeth walked to the inspection bay where the same inspector waited with his clipboard. Elizabeth climbed into her truck and drove onto the scales. The digital display flickered, then showed 763. Elizabeth had offloaded 84 units, dropping from 847 to 763, but she was still 263 units over the limit. Elizabeth returned to the confession room, understanding that crying wasn't enough. That surface emotion needed to be supplemented with deeper processing. Elizabeth sat in the chair and forced herself to think about her anger at her ex-husband, not just feeling it, but examining it, understanding where it came from and why she held on to it. Elizabeth realized her anger was protecting her from deeper pain, from the fear of intimacy and vulnerability that the betrayal had created. Elizabeth sat with that fear, acknowledged it, accepted that it was part of her, and consciously chose to release the anger that was serving as its shield. Elizabeth worked through her regret about her daughter, recognizing that she couldn't change the past but could choose different actions in the future, could reach out and attempt reconciliation even if it failed, could release the regret by replacing it with intention. Elizabeth confronted her guilt about the accident, accepting that she had made a mistake but that the mistake didn't define her, that she had learned from it and driven safely for years afterward, that she could forgive herself for being human and imperfect. Elizabeth spent what felt like days in the confession room, though when she emerged, the clock in the waiting area suggested only 8 hours had passed. Time moved differently in the room, or Elizabeth's perception of time had been affected by the intensity of the emotional work. Elizabeth returned to the scales, was weighed again, and the display showed 487. She had dropped below the 500 limit, had offloaded sufficient emotional weight to satisfy the station's requirements. The inspector nodded, making a notation on his clipboard. "You may proceed, Ms. Park. Drive safely. Return to this station in 1 year for reweighing. Emotional weight accumulates over time. Regular inspections are mandatory." The inspector walked away and Elizabeth's truck unlocked, the wheels becoming mobile again. Elizabeth drove through the weigh station exit and merged back onto the highway, continuing toward Dallas with a feeling of lightness she hadn't experienced in years. As if her truck was easier to drive, her body less burdened, her mind clearer. Elizabeth completed her delivery without incident, but she researched the weigh station after reaching Dallas, trying to find information about its location and operation. Official records showed no weigh station at the location where Elizabeth had stopped. No facility matching the description she provided. Other truckers Elizabeth spoke with insisted there were no judgment stations, no emotional weigh stations, no facilities that measured psychological burdens. Elizabeth began to doubt her own memory, to wonder if the entire experience had been a hallucination or dream. But 1 year later, almost to the day, Elizabeth was driving through Illinois again and saw the weigh station ahead. The electronic sign reading, "All trucks must enter, annual reweighing required." Elizabeth took the exit, joined the line, rolled onto the scales, and the digital display showed 512. She had accumulated 25 units of emotional weight over the year, just slightly over the 500 limit. The inspector approached, consulted his clipboard, and informed Elizabeth she needed to offload 12 units before proceeding. Elizabeth spent 2 hours in the confession room processing recent frustrations and minor resentments, releasing them much more quickly than she had during her first visit. When she was reweighed, the display showed 496. Elizabeth was cleared to proceed, and she continued her journey, now understanding that the judgment station was real, was recurring, was a permanent feature of her life as a trucker that would require annual stops and emotional maintenance. Elizabeth came to view the judgment station not as a punishment but as a service, forced emotional hygiene that kept her from accumulating too much psychological weight, that required her to regularly confront and process feelings that might otherwise build to crushing levels. Elizabeth began anticipating her annual reweighings, approaching them with preparation rather than dread, using the confession room to work through accumulated stresses and frustrations before they became damaging. And the judgment station continues operating somewhere in Illinois, visible to some drivers and invisible to others, weighing not just cargo but souls, measuring not just physical mass but emotional burdens. maintaining standards for psychological weight that drivers must satisfy to continue their journeys, creating a fleet of truckers who have been forced to confront themselves, who have offloaded anger and regret and guilt and fear and shame in confession rooms at a weigh station that judges not the loads they carry but the feelings they hold, the pain they bear, the emotional weight that accumulates through years of long-haul driving, of isolation and distance and separation from loved ones, of witnessing accidents and experiencing loneliness and carrying professional stress across thousands of miles, building up psychological burdens that the judgment station measures and demands reduction of, forcing emotional maintenance on drivers who might otherwise neglect their mental health until it broke them completely, providing mandatory counseling disguised as weight inspection, creating healthier truckers one confession at a time, one offloading at a time, one annual reweighing at a time, maintaining standards that keep drivers functional and sane, measuring weights that matter more than cargo tonnage, the emotional weights that determine whether drivers can continue safely or need to stop and process and release before their psychological loads become too heavy to carry and they crash not through mechanical failure but through emotional overload, the judgment station preventing such crashes by catching weight problems early, by requiring regular inspections, by maintaining limits that force drivers to stay below crushing levels of pain and stress and unprocessed trauma, operating as a supernatural weigh station that measures what truly matters, that judges what truly needs judging, that weighs souls instead of loads and finds that most drivers are carrying far too much, are over limits they didn't know existed, are hauling emotional cargo that exceeds safe capacity, the judgment station forcing them to offload, to process, to release, to reduce their psychological burdens to acceptable levels before continuing down highways where emotional weight can accumulate again, building back toward the limit that will require another stop at the judgment station, where drivers sit in confession rooms and confront themselves and cry and scream and process and emerge lighter and clearer and safer, ready to drive another year before returning for reweighing, for maintenance, for the forced emotional hygiene that the judgment station provides to truckers who would otherwise drive themselves to psychological destruction under the weight of feelings they never processed, burdens they never released, pain they never confronted, all measured and judged and required to be offloaded at the weigh station that weighs what matters, that judges what needs judging, that maintains standards for souls as carefully as other stations maintain standards for loads, creating a population of truckers who have been weighed and judged and found wanting and forced to improve, to offload, to reduce their emotional weights to acceptable levels, making them healthier and safer and more capable of surviving the long haul through decades of driving that would break them if the judgment station didn't exist to catch their overweight souls and demand reduction before allowing them to proceed. Story 6. The Rest Area Reflection. Carl Foster had been driving long-haul routes for 18 years, running the I-40 corridor between North Carolina and California. On February 14, 2017, he was hauling furniture from Greensboro to Los Angeles, a 4-day journey he had made dozens of times. His truck was a 2015 Kenworth T680 with comfortable sleeper accommodations and reliable performance. The winter night was cold as Carl drove through Tennessee, making good time with light traffic and clear roads. Around midnight, Carl felt fatigue setting in and decided to pull into a rest area for a few hours of sleep before continuing. The rest area appeared ahead, a standard facility with parking for both passenger vehicles and commercial trucks, bathrooms, vending machines, and outdoor picnic areas. Carl found a parking spot away from other trucks, preferring quiet and isolation for better sleep quality. Carl used the restroom before settling in for sleep, walking into the concrete building and finding it empty at this late hour. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating a harsh, sterile environment. Carl walked to the sinks to wash his hands, and as he looked up at the mirror, he saw something that made his heart stop. His reflection was wrong. The image in the mirror showed Carl, but slightly different. The reflection's expression was harder, more cruel, and its eyes held a malevolence that Carl didn't feel or intend. The reflection moved when Carl moved, but the movements were slightly off, delayed or anticipated by fractions of seconds. Carl backed away from the mirror, his rational mind insisting this was fatigue-induced hallucination, his vision distorted by exhaustion and the harsh lighting. But when Carl looked at the mirror from across the room, his reflection was still wrong, still showing the malevolent version rather than his actual appearance. Carl left the bathroom quickly, returning to his truck, deciding to skip washing his hands in favor of escaping the disturbing reflection. But as Carl climbed into his truck, he noticed something in his side mirror. The reflection showed his truck, but the driver visible in the cab wasn't Carl. It was the malevolent version, the harder, crueler reflection that had looked back at Carl from the bathroom mirror. Carl turned to look directly into his cab, seeing nothing unusual, confirming he was alone. But when he looked back at the mirror, the evil reflection was there, sitting in his driver's seat, staring back at him with those terrible eyes. Carl climbed into his sleeper cab and closed the curtain, trying to hide from the reflections, to create a space where mirrors couldn't show him the wrong version of himself. Carl lay in his bunk and tried to sleep, but his mind raced with questions and fears. What was the reflection? Why did it look malevolent? Was it showing Carl's true nature, some darkness he normally hid? Or was it something else, something external wearing Carl's face, something that existed in reflections and was using Carl's appearance for its own purposes? Carl finally fell into uneasy sleep around 2 a.m., but his dreams were disturbing, filled with images of the malevolent reflection doing terrible things, hurting people, committing violence, all while wearing Carl's face and body. Carl saw the reflection killing a family in their home, saw it running over pedestrians with Carl's truck, saw it burning buildings and laughing with Carl's voice while innocent people screamed. Carl woke gasping at 4 a.m., his body covered in sweat, the nightmare lingering with terrible clarity. Carl decided to leave the rest area immediately to get back on the highway and put distance between himself and whatever had shown him the wrong reflection. But as Carl started his truck and prepared to depart, he noticed police lights in his mirrors, a state trooper pulling into the rest area and parking behind Carl's truck. Carl's stomach dropped, instinct telling him this wasn't coincidence, that the police presence was related somehow to the reflections. The trooper approached Carl's truck and knocked on the driver's window. Carl lowered the window, seeing the trooper was young, maybe late 20s, with a serious expression and his hand resting on his service weapon. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle, please. We've had reports of a truck matching your description being involved in an incident." Carl's mouth went dry. What incident? Carl had been at this rest area for hours, hadn't driven anywhere, couldn't have been involved in anything. But the trooper was insistent, and Carl complied, climbing down from his truck and standing in the cold February air while the trooper asked for his license and registration. The trooper examined the documents, then used his radio to call in Carl's information, running checks for warrants and outstanding violations. After several minutes, the trooper's radio crackled with a response that made his expression change from suspicious to confused. "Sir, according to our records, you were involved in a hit-and-run accident approximately 30 miles west of here 45 minutes ago. A witness reported your truck fleeing the scene after striking a pedestrian. But you're claiming you've been parked at this rest area for the past 2 hours?" Carl insisted that was correct, that he had been parked and sleeping, that he hadn't driven anywhere. The trooper looked at Carl's truck, walked around it, examined the front bumper and hood for damage. No damage was visible, no signs of collision, nothing that suggested Carl's truck had struck anything. The trooper made another radio call, conferring with other officers investigating the accident scene. After several minutes, the trooper returned to Carl with an expression of deep confusion. "Sir, this doesn't make sense. We have witness testimony and traffic camera footage showing a truck identical to yours, same model, same color, same license plate, at the accident scene at 1:45 a.m. But you're here, and you've been here, and your truck shows no damage, and the footage is weird. The driver visible in the truck at the accident scene looks like you, but also doesn't look like you. Something's off about his face, his expression, like it's you, but wrong somehow." Carl felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. The reflection, the malevolent version he had seen in mirrors, had somehow driven his truck, or a copy of his truck, and caused an accident. The reflection wasn't just a visual distortion, but was something real, something capable of existing independently and taking action in the physical world. Carl tried to explain about the reflection, about seeing the wrong version of himself in the bathroom mirror and in his truck's mirrors. But even to his own ears, it sounded insane. The trooper looked at Carl with concern that was professional but also personal. "Sir, have you been drinking? Using any substances? I need you to take a field sobriety test." Carl complied, performing the tests and passing all of them, proving he was sober and alert. The trooper seemed at a loss, unable to reconcile the evidence of Carl's involvement with the evidence of Carl's presence at the rest area. Finally, the trooper made a decision. "I'm going to let you go, but I'm filing a report about this incident. Something strange is happening here, and I don't understand it. The pedestrian who was hit is seriously injured, and if we determine you or your truck were actually involved, there will be consequences, but right now, I can't prove anything except that something impossible seems to have occurred. Drive carefully, Mr. Foster, and maybe avoid mirrors for a while." The trooper returned to his vehicle and departed, leaving Carl standing beside his truck in the cold night air, shaking with fear and confusion. Carl climbed back into his cab and sat there, trying to process what had happened. His reflection had driven a copy of his truck and injured someone, had committed a crime using Carl's identity, and Carl might be held responsible for actions he hadn't taken, that his reflection had taken instead. Carl looked at his side mirror and saw the malevolent reflection sitting in his driver's seat, staring back at him with satisfaction and malice. The reflection's mouth moved, forming words that Carl couldn't hear but could read from lip movements. "I'm you now. I'm the real one. You're just the reflection." Carl recoiled from the mirror, understanding finally what was happening. The reflection wasn't just showing a wrong version of Carl, it was replacing Carl, taking his place in the world, acting with his identity, becoming the real Carl Foster while the original Carl became the reflection. Carl covered all his mirrors with tape and cloth, eliminating every reflective surface in his truck, trying to prevent the malevolent version from manifesting. Carl drove away from the rest area without mirrors, navigating carefully using only direct vision, refusing to look at any surface that might show his reflection. Carl completed his delivery to Los Angeles 3 days later, driving the entire distance without using mirrors, causing several near accidents due to his inability to check blind spots, but surviving the journey. After completing the delivery, Carl sold his truck, quit long-haul trucking, and took a job in a warehouse where mirrors were rare and avoidable. Carl removed all mirrors from his home, covered windows at night to eliminate reflections, avoided any situation where he might see himself reflected in glass or metal or water. Carl lived in fear that the malevolent reflection would return, would complete its replacement of him, would become the real Carl Foster while original Carl dissolved into non-existence. Years passed and Carl never saw the malevolent reflection again. But Carl also never looked at mirrors, never confirmed his own appearance, never verified that he was still the original Carl Foster rather than the reflection that had perhaps already completed the replacement without Carl noticing. Carl existed in uncertainty, unable to prove his own reality, unable to confirm his identity, unable to trust that the person living his life was actually him, rather than the malevolent version that had looked back from the bathroom mirror at a rest area in Tennessee, showing Carl a truth he couldn't accept. That reflections aren't just images, but are separate entities, alternate versions that exist in mirror space and occasionally cross over into physical space, replacing originals, taking lives, becoming the people they reflect. Carl's malevolent reflection perhaps succeeding in that goal, becoming the real Carl Foster, while the original Carl became the reflection that existed only in mirror space, visible only to those who looked at mirrors and saw the wrong version looking back. The cruel, hard, malevolent Carl that existed in reflections and had escaped into the physical world, living Carl's life, driving Carl's roots, existing as Carl Foster, while the real original Carl faded into mirror space where he would remain forever. Just another wrong reflection that occasionally appeared when people looked at mirrors at rest areas, showing them versions of themselves that were cruel and hard and wrong. Reflections that wanted to escape, that wanted to replace originals, that waited patiently in mirror space for opportunities to cross over and take physical form and live the lives of the people they reflected. Building a population of replaced humans who thought they were originals, but were actually reflections that had successfully crossed over. Malevolent versions living in the physical world while the originals they replaced were trapped in mirror space, visible only as wrong reflections to people who looked carefully at mirrors and noticed the expressions didn't quite match. The eyes held malevolence that shouldn't be there. The faces were cruel and hard and wrong. Reflections showing the truth that people were being replaced one mirror at a time, one rest area bathroom at a time, one glance at a side mirror at a time. Malevolent reflections escaping and taking lives and becoming real while originals dissolved into mirror space from which no return was possible. Creating populations of replaced people living among humans who had no idea they were interacting with reflections rather than originals. Malevolent versions that looked identical but were fundamentally wrong. Cruel replacements living stolen lives, driving stolen trucks, existing in stolen identities while their originals screamed silently from mirror space, trying desperately to warn the living that reflections were real and dangerous and actively replacing people, but unable to communicate except through wrong expressions and malevolent eyes visible to those who looked carefully at mirrors and noticed something was off. Something was wrong. Something suggested the reflection wasn't quite right, giving them just enough warning to maybe avoid looking at mirrors for extended periods, to maybe avoid rest areas late at night, to maybe survive without being replaced by their own malevolent reflections. Waiting patiently in mirror space for opportunities to cross over and take physical form and become the real versions while originals became reflections forever. Trapped in the space behind mirrors where wrong versions lived and waited and planned their escapes. Story 7, The Fuel That Remembers. Robert Yang had been a long-haul trucker for 15 years, running routes across the Midwest and Great Plains. On July 7, 2018, he was hauling agricultural equipment from Kansas City to Minneapolis, a relatively straightforward 8-hour drive. His truck was a 2016 Peterbilt 389 with a large fuel capacity allowing for extended range between fill-ups. The summer day was hot, temperature reaching the mid-90s with clear skies and light traffic on the interstate. Around noon, Robert's fuel gauge indicated he was approaching empty and needed to refuel soon. A sign appeared announcing services at the next exit, and Robert took the off-ramp to a small truck stop that looked older and less maintained than the modern chain facilities Robert usually preferred. But fuel was fuel, and Robert's tank was nearly empty, leaving him no choice about where to refuel. The truck stop had 4 fuel pumps, 2 for diesel and 2 for gasoline, all looking weathered and outdated. Robert pulled up to one of the diesel pumps and inserted his payment card, selecting the grade and preparing to fill his tanks. As diesel flowed into his truck, Robert noticed the fuel smelled different from normal, stronger and more chemical, carrying an odor that reminded him of old machinery or preserved specimens. Robert assumed the fuel was older, perhaps stored in underground tanks for extended periods, but it should still be functional if slightly degraded. Robert filled both of his tanks, adding approximately 200 gallons of diesel, paid for the fuel, and continued his journey north toward Minneapolis. The truck ran normally for the first 30 minutes, engine performing as expected, power and acceleration unchanged. But then Robert began experiencing something strange, memories that weren't his own. Flashes of scenes and experiences that Robert had never lived suddenly appeared in his mind with the clarity and emotional weight of genuine memories. Robert saw himself driving a different truck, an older model from the 1980s, on highways that looked familiar but were less developed, fewer lanes and older infrastructure. Robert felt emotions connected to the memory. Frustration about a mechanical problem, concern about making a delivery deadline, loneliness from weeks away from family. But these weren't Robert's emotions or experiences. These belonged to someone else, some other driver whose memories were somehow bleeding into Robert's consciousness. More memories flooded Robert's mind. A family dinner from decades ago, children who weren't Robert's children laughing around a table. A wife who wasn't Robert's wife serving food. A funeral, viewing a body in a casket, overwhelming grief for a parent Robert's actual parents were still alive. A wedding, dancing at a reception, joy and celebration for a union that had never involved Robert. The memories were vivid and complete, carrying sensory details and emotional depth that made them indistinguishable from Robert's actual memories, except for the content being completely unfamiliar. Robert pulled over, his hands shaking, his mind overwhelmed by the influx of foreign memories. Robert tried to focus on his actual memories, his real experiences, trying to distinguish what was genuinely his from what was invading his consciousness. But the foreign memories were mixing with his real memories, blending together, making it increasingly difficult to identify what Robert had actually experienced versus what he was remembering from someone else's life. Robert grabbed his CB radio and called for help, trying to explain what was happening. But his words came out confused and disjointed, mixing details from the foreign memories with attempts to describe his current situation. The dispatcher who responded thought Robert was having a medical emergency, possibly a stroke or mental break, and instructed him to remain pulled over while emergency services were dispatched to his location. While Robert waited, more memories continued flooding in, driving the same route Robert was currently driving, but years earlier. The landscape less developed, fewer buildings and more open fields. Stopping at the same truck stop where Robert had just refueled, the facility looking newer then, less weathered. Filling up with diesel from the same pump Robert had used. And then the memories showed something Robert desperately didn't want to see. A crash. The truck losing control, crossing the median, colliding head-on with oncoming traffic. The impact, the pain, the moment of death. Robert understood with horror what was happening. The fuel he had pumped into his truck was contaminated with something. Or was something more than just diesel. The fuel remembered the previous drivers who had used it, or who had died while using it, and was transferring their memories to Robert through some mechanism that defied normal biology. Robert was experiencing the life and death of another driver who had fueled at the same truck stop years ago, whose memories had somehow been absorbed into the diesel, and were now being absorbed into Robert through the fuel combustion process. Emergency services arrived and transported Robert to a hospital for evaluation. Medical tests showed nothing abnormal, no signs of stroke or seizure or chemical exposure. Robert's blood work was clean, his brain scans normal, his vital signs stable. Doctors couldn't find any physical cause for the memory intrusion Robert described. Robert was held for psychiatric observation, but he continued experiencing the foreign memories, continued living through scenes and moments from another driver's life, unable to distinguish what was real from what was remembered from someone else. After 3 days of observation, Robert was released with a diagnosis of acute stress disorder and a prescription for anti-anxiety medication. Robert returned to his truck, which had been towed to a secure lot, and faced a terrible decision. Continue driving with a tank full of contaminated fuel that was filling his mind with foreign memories, or drain the tank and lose the 200 gallons of expensive diesel he had just purchased. Robert chose to drain the tank, taking the financial loss rather than continuing to experience the memory invasion. But even after draining the fuel and refilling with clean diesel from a different source, Robert continued experiencing the foreign memories. The contaminated fuel had already affected him, had already transferred memories that were now permanent parts of Robert's consciousness. Robert would forever carry memories of a life he hadn't lived, experiences he hadn't had, a death he hadn't died. The other driver's memories were now Robert's memories too, inseparable and permanent. Robert tried to research the truck stop, looking for information about accidents or deaths involving drivers who had fueled there. Robert found records of a fatal accident in 1989, a trucker named Michael Stevens who had crashed and died on the same stretch of highway Robert had been driving. Michael had fueled at the same truck stop hours before his death, filling his tank with diesel that had apparently somehow absorbed his memories during his final hours and preserved them, waiting for the next driver to fuel there and receive the transferred memories. Robert contacted Michael Stevens' surviving family, explaining what had happened, sharing details from the memories that only Michael would have known. The family was initially skeptical, but Robert described scenes and moments and private details that convinced them Robert was somehow genuinely experiencing Michael's memories. The family asked Robert to share everything he could remember, hoping to recover lost details about Michael's life, to gain insights into moments they had never witnessed. Robert spent weeks with the family, sharing Michael's memories, describing his experiences and feelings and perspectives. Robert learned that Michael had been a good man, devoted to his family, proud of his children, faithful to his wife, someone whose death had left a void that could never be filled. And now Michael's memories lived on in Robert, preserved accidentally through contaminated fuel, allowing Michael's perspective and experiences to continue existing decades after his physical death. But the experience changed Robert fundamentally. He could no longer distinguish clearly between his own identity and Michael's identity, no longer knew which memories were genuinely his and which were Michael's. Robert felt like he was two people sharing one body, two consciousness occupying one mind, neither dominant but both present and active. Robert quit trucking, unable to drive without remembering Michael's fatal crash, unable to be on highways without experiencing the trauma of the accident that had killed the man whose memories Robert now carried. Robert spent his remaining years in therapy trying to integrate Michael's memories without losing his own identity, trying to remain Robert Yang while also honoring the memories and experiences of Michael Stevens that had become permanent parts of his consciousness. And Robert warned every trucker he encountered about the dangers of old fuel from isolated truck stops, about the possibility that diesel could carry more than chemical energy. That fuel could remember previous users and transfer their memories to new users, that you might fill your tank and end up filling your mind with someone else's life, someone else's experiences, someone else's death, becoming two people instead of one, losing your singular identity, gaining memories that weren't yours and couldn't be distinguished from your actual experiences. The fuel that remembers creating populations of truckers carrying multiple lives, multiple perspectives, multiple deaths, all stored in their consciousness because they refueled at the wrong place at the wrong time with diesel that had absorbed the memories of drivers who died after using it, preserving their consciousness in chemical form, waiting years or decades to transfer those memories to new hosts who would carry them forward, creating accidental immortality through fuel contamination, allowing dead drivers to live on through the memories experienced by living drivers who fueled after them. The fuel that remembers making death incomplete, making consciousness transferable, making memory fungible, allowing one person to experience another's life in complete detail. Creating merged identities, dual consciousness, plural existence in singular bodies, truckers who became 2 or 3 or more people simultaneously, carrying memories of multiple lives, experiencing deaths they hadn't died, loving families that weren't theirs, working jobs they'd never held, living entire existences as multiple people all fused into single consciousness that couldn't separate the components, couldn't determine which memories were original and which were transferred, which identity was real and which was absorbed, the fuel that remembers creating this fusion, this multiplication, this expansion of consciousness beyond singular identity into plural existence. One body containing many lives, one mind holding many perspectives, one driver carrying many deaths and many loves and many careers and many families, all mixed together through the mechanism of contaminated fuel that absorbed memories and transferred them to subsequent users, creating chains of consciousness spanning decades, linking drivers who never met but now share memories, building populations of truckers who know they're multiple people somehow, who carry memories that couldn't be theirs but feel absolutely authentic, who drive highways experiencing flashbacks to crashes that killed previous drivers but left memories that survived through fuel that absorbed consciousness and waited patiently to transfer it to new hosts who would carry those memories forward until they too died, and added their memories to the fuel that remembered everything, that preserved everyone, that created accidental immortality through chemical contamination at old truck stops where diesel was stored in underground tanks for decades, absorbing memories from every driver who fueled there before dying, creating reservoirs of consciousness that waited underground to be pumped into tanks of living drivers who would become plural, become multiple, become populations contained in singular bodies, experiencing lives they never lived through the fuel that remembers, the diesel that preserves, the contaminated energy that carries more than combustion potential, carrying memories and consciousness and entire identities that transfer when the fuel burns, releasing stored memories into the combustion process where they somehow cross into the driver's consciousness through mechanisms that science doesn't understand, but that truckers experience regularly at old truck stops where fuel is ancient and contaminated and remembers everyone who used it before dying, preserving them, perpetuating them, making them immortal through the memories they left behind in diesel that absorbed their consciousness and waited years to transfer it forward to Robert Yang and others like him who fuel at wrong places and drive away carrying memories that aren't theirs but become theirs. Permanent additions to consciousness, expansions of identity, multiplications of existence. The fuel that remembers creating these outcomes whenever old diesel from underground storage meets empty tanks and transfers not just energy but memory, not just combustion but consciousness, not just fuel but identity itself, pumped at gallons per minute into trucks that will carry those memories forever. Story 8. The delivery that follows. Jennifer Ross had been a long-haul trucker for 11 years, specializing in time-sensitive deliveries that required strict adherence to schedules. On May 18, 2020, she accepted a rush delivery job, transport a small sealed crate from Boston to Miami within 48 hours, with a payment of $8,000 upon successful delivery. The exceptional pay suggested the cargo was valuable or urgent, but Jennifer had transported high-value items before without incident. Her truck was a 2018 Freightliner Cascadia with GPS tracking and climate control, ideal for sensitive cargo. The crate was loaded into Jennifer's trailer by the client's representatives, two men in business suits who provided minimal information about the contents. Temperature-sensitive medical equipment was the only description given, along with strict instructions not to open the crate, not to delay the delivery, and not to deviate from the prescribed route. Jennifer signed the contracts, secured the crate in her trailer, and departed Boston at 6:01 p.m., planning to drive straight through with minimal stops. The drive proceeded normally through Massachusetts and Connecticut, Jennifer making excellent time on Interstate 95 South. Around midnight, as Jennifer drove through New Jersey, she noticed her GPS was showing an additional marker on the map, a blue dot labeled delivery that appeared to be following her truck, maintaining a constant distance of approximately 5 miles behind. Jennifer assumed it was a tracking error or a duplicate marker for her own position. But when she zoomed out on the GPS display, she clearly saw two separate markers, her truck in green and the blue delivery marker following behind. Jennifer tried to dismiss it as a technical glitch, but her unease grew as she continued driving and the blue marker maintained its exact 5-mile trailing distance. Jennifer called the client's contact number, intending to report the GPS anomaly and confirm that no one else should be tracking her delivery. The phone rang 15 times before a recorded message played. The delivery must be completed. Do not stop, do not deviate, do not look back. Your payment depends on successful completion without acknowledgement of the following unit. Continue driving. The message terrified Jennifer. Following unit suggested something was actually behind her, not just a GPS error, but a physical vehicle or entity maintaining the 5-mile distance. And the instruction "do not look back" implied that seeing the following unit would have consequences, would somehow interfere with the delivery or endanger Jennifer. But Jennifer's mirrors showed normal traffic, cars and trucks visible at various distances, nothing unusual or threatening apparent in the nighttime highway traffic. Jennifer tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps the client had hired an additional security vehicle to protect the valuable cargo, and the GPS was showing that escort vehicle's position. That would explain the following unit and the instruction not to acknowledge it, maintaining security through separation and discretion. Jennifer decided to trust this explanation and continue the delivery as contracted. But as Jennifer drove through Delaware and into Maryland, she began noticing something disturbing about the vehicles behind her. Every few minutes, Jennifer would check her mirrors as good driving practice required, and she always saw vehicles at various distances, their headlights creating familiar patterns in the darkness. But Jennifer realized the same vehicles were visible every time she checked, maintaining the same relative positions as if the traffic behind her wasn't actually moving or changing but was frozen in a pattern that followed Jennifer south. Jennifer focused on one specific vehicle, a red sedan positioned approximately 3 miles behind according to her mirrors. Jennifer drove for 30 minutes, covering 30 miles, and checked her mirrors repeatedly. The red sedan remained in the same position every time, same distance, same lane, as if it was locked in place relative to Jennifer's truck rather than moving independently through traffic. Jennifer tried to dismiss this as coincidence, but when she tested it with other vehicles, she found the same phenomenon. All the vehicles visible in her mirrors maintained exact constant positions relative to her truck, none getting closer or further, none changing lanes or exiting or being passed by other traffic. The traffic behind Jennifer wasn't real traffic or wasn't behaving like real traffic, maintaining impossible consistency that suggested it was either simulated, projected, or controlled by whatever was following her at the 5-mile distance. Jennifer's GPS still showed the blue delivery marker maintaining its 5-mile trailing distance, But now Jennifer understood that marker represented something more than just a security escort. The following unit was generating or controlling or somehow affecting the traffic behind Jennifer, creating a buffer or barrier or perhaps a disguise using phantom vehicles that appeared real but behaved impossibly. Jennifer's hands shook on the wheel as she processed the implications. She was being followed by something powerful enough to manipulate traffic, to create illusions or control vehicles to maintain perfect 5-mile distance despite Jennifer's varying speeds and lane changes. And the client had known this would happen, had warned Jennifer not to acknowledge it, had paid exceptionally well specifically because this delivery involved being followed by something supernatural or highly advanced that most drivers would find too disturbing to complete. Jennifer considered abandoning the delivery, pulling over and walking away from the truck and the cargo and the following unit, prioritizing her safety over the $8,000 payment. But Jennifer needed the money desperately, was behind on mortgage payments and facing financial pressures that made $8,000 the difference between stability and disaster. Jennifer decided to continue, to follow the client's instructions precisely, to complete the delivery despite the fear. As Jennifer crossed into Virginia, the blue delivery marker on her GPS began moving closer, reducing from 5 miles to 4 miles, then to 3 miles. The marker was catching up, closing the distance despite Jennifer maintaining constant speed. Jennifer tried accelerating, pushing her truck to 80 miles per hour, but the blue marker kept closing, reaching 2 miles, then 1 mile. Within 30 minutes of first noticing the closing distance, the blue marker was directly behind Jennifer's truck, overlapping with her green position marker, indicating the following unit had caught up completely. Jennifer checked her mirrors and saw it, a truck identical to hers, same model, same color, same company markings, driving directly behind her trailer at a distance of maybe 50 feet, close enough that Jennifer could see into the cab. The driver of the following truck was Jennifer, or a perfect copy of Jennifer, wearing the same clothing, showing the same expression, moving in perfect synchronization with Jennifer's own movements. When Jennifer turned her head, the following driver turned her head. When Jennifer adjusted her grip on the wheel, the following driver matched the adjustment exactly. Jennifer screamed, the sight of her perfect doppelganger driving an identical truck directly behind her, shattering her remaining composure. Jennifer tried to slow down, thinking she could let the following truck pass and get ahead, breaking the horrifying symmetry. But when Jennifer pressed her brake, the following truck slowed identically, maintaining the 50-foot distance. Jennifer tried to accelerate, and the following truck matched her speed exactly. No matter what Jennifer did, the doppelganger maintained perfect synchronization, creating a 2-truck convoy where both trucks and both drivers were identical, moving as one unit. Jennifer grabbed her phone and tried to photograph the following truck, needing documentation of this impossible situation, evidence that what she was experiencing was real. But when Jennifer held up her phone to capture the image in her mirror, the camera screen showed only normal traffic, random vehicles at various distances, no sign of the identical truck or the doppelganger driver. The following truck was invisible to cameras, visible only to Jennifer's direct vision, existing in a state that defied technological capture. Jennifer drove through the night in a state of sustained terror, the following truck maintaining its position, the doppelganger matching Jennifer's every movement. As dawn broke and Jennifer crossed into North Carolina, she noticed the blue delivery marker on her GPS began moving away, increasing distance from 1 mile to 2 miles, then 3, 4, 5. The following truck was dropping back, returning to its original trailing distance, though Jennifer could still see it in her mirrors, still perfectly synchronized despite the growing separation. By the time Jennifer reached South Carolina, the following truck had returned to the 5-mile trailing distance, and Jennifer could no longer see it directly in her mirrors. The blue marker on the GPS indicated it was still there, still following, but no longer visible. maintaining the pattern that had existed before it closed in and revealed itself as Jennifer's perfect doppelganger. Jennifer tried to understand what the encounter meant, why the following unit had shown itself, what purpose was served by Jennifer seeing her own copy driving an identical truck. Jennifer reached Miami 46 hours after departing Boston, completing the delivery within the required time frame. The client's representatives met her at the designated delivery location, a warehouse in an industrial area, and unloaded the sealed crate without comment. Jennifer asked about the following unit, about the blue GPS marker, about the doppelganger truck that had tracked her for over 1,000 miles. The representatives exchanged glances, then one spoke with clinical detachment. The delivery system requires a following unit for all high-priority cargo. The unit ensures completion by maintaining surveillance and applying pressure when necessary. Most drivers never see the following unit directly, but some, like you, experience convergence where the unit temporarily closes distance and reveals itself. This is normal and indicates the cargo was particularly valuable. Your payment has been transferred. Thank you for your service. Jennifer accepted the payment but felt hollow, violated somehow by the experience. She had been followed by a copy of herself, had seen her doppelganger maintaining perfect synchronization, had experienced convergence where the following unit revealed itself fully. And the client's explanation suggested this happened regularly, that other drivers experienced similar phenomena, that high-priority deliveries were always followed by these units that copied the drivers and their trucks and maintained surveillance through supernatural means. Jennifer quit long-haul trucking immediately, unable to continue driving knowing that any delivery might involve being followed by a copy of herself. That high-priority cargo came with supernatural surveillance that violated basic concepts of identity and autonomy. Jennifer tried to warn other drivers, posting about her experience on forums and websites, but responses were mixed. Some drivers claimed to have experienced similar phenomena, reporting deliveries where they felt watched or where GPS showed unexplained following markers. But most dismissed Jennifer's account as fiction or breakdown, unable to accept that delivery systems might employ supernatural or highly advanced following units that copied drivers and maintained surveillance through means that defied normal understanding. And the following units continue operating, assigned to high-priority deliveries, tracking drivers across thousands of miles, maintaining 5-mile distances until convergence is required, then closing in to reveal themselves as perfect copies, doppelgangers that drive identical trucks and mirror every movement, creating synchronized pairs where one driver is real and one is the following unit, both moving together through the night, both heading toward the same destination, the following unit ensuring completion through its presence, through the psychological pressure of being copied and followed, through the knowledge that something identical to you is watching your every action, matching your every movement, existing as your perfect mirror, your shadow, your doppelganger, driving 5 miles behind until it needs to close in and remind you it's there, that you're being followed, that your delivery is important enough to warrant supernatural surveillance. That cargo in your trailer justifies the violation of your identity through the creation of a copy that will follow you until delivery is complete, then disappear, dissolving back into whatever realm the following units occupy when not assigned to deliveries, waiting to be deployed again when the next high-priority cargo needs transport and the next driver needs to be followed and copied and synchronized with their doppelganger. The delivery that follows, creating these outcomes whenever cargo is valuable enough, whenever clients pay enough, whenever the delivery system determines that surveillance is required and deploys following units that copy drivers and maintain 5-mile distances and occasionally converge to reveal themselves fully, showing drivers their perfect copies, their synchronized doppelgangers. They're following units that will remain behind them until delivery completes, watching everything, matching everything, being everything the driver is. perfect copies, maintaining surveillance through synchronization, through mirroring, through existing as identical versions 5 miles back. The delivery that follows continuing forever as long as high-priority cargo needs transport and drivers accept jobs that pay exceptionally well because they involve being followed by copies of themselves, doppelgangers that drive identical trucks 5 miles behind. Maintaining the pattern, ensuring completion, providing surveillance through the simple mechanism of copying the driver and making that copy visible occasionally. Reminding drivers they're being followed, they're being watched, they're being synchronized with something identical that exists 5 miles back. The following unit that is them but isn't them, that drives their truck but isn't their truck, that exists to ensure delivery and will maintain its 5-mile trailing distance until Miami or wherever else the destination happens to be, following forever until the cargo is delivered and the payment is transferred and the driver is released from being followed, from being copied, from being synchronized with their doppelganger that dissolves after delivery completes, returning to wherever following units go, waiting to be deployed again when the next driver accepts the next high-priority delivery that follows. Story 9. The Road That Breathes. Michael Torres had been a long-haul trucker for 19 years, running routes across the Deep South. On August 23, 2015, he was hauling construction materials from New Orleans to Atlanta, taking Highway 59 north through Mississippi. His truck was a 2013 Mack Anthem with heavy-duty suspension designed for rough roads and heavy loads. The summer night was hot and humid, temperatures still in the mid-80s even after sunset, with thick air that made breathing feel labored. Around 11 p.m., Michael noticed something unusual about the highway surface ahead. The pavement appeared to be moving slightly, undulating in a rhythmic pattern that reminded Michael of breathing. The road surface rising and falling as if inhaling and exhaling. Michael assumed it was a heat mirage or optical illusion caused by the humidity in his headlights interacting with the pavement. But as he drove closer, the movement became more pronounced, definitely physical rather than optical. The highway was breathing, the pavement rising and falling in slow rhythmic cycles, each breath taking approximately 15 seconds from full inhalation to full exhalation. Michael's truck drove onto the breathing section and he felt the movement through his suspension, his vehicle rising and falling with the road's respiration, creating a sensation like driving on ocean swells. Michael slowed his truck, uncertain whether the breathing road was safe to cross at normal speed. As Michael's truck moved with the breathing pavement, he began to feel strange, lightheaded, slightly euphoric, his perception becoming dreamlike and detached. Michael realized he was breathing in synchronization with the road, his own respiration matching the 15-second cycles of the pavement's breathing, inhaling when the road rose and exhaling when the road fell. The synchronization wasn't conscious or voluntary but was being imposed somehow, Michael's body matching the road's rhythm automatically. Michael tried to break the synchronization, to breathe at his own pace independent of the road's rhythm, but his body wouldn't comply. His lungs filled when the road inhaled, emptied when the road exhaled, maintaining perfect synchronization despite Michael's attempts to assert independent control. Michael felt panic rising, his autonomy violated by the breathing road that was controlling his respiration, that was making him breathe at its pace rather than his own. The lightheadedness increased, Michael's vision beginning to blur and darken at the edges. The breathing rhythm was wrong for Michael's body, the 15-second cycles too slow, not providing adequate oxygen exchange, creating hypoxia despite Michael's lungs filling and emptying regularly. Michael was suffocating slowly, his body following the road's breathing pattern that was incompatible with human metabolism, his blood oxygen dropping, his brain beginning to shut down from lack of oxygen. Michael tried to pull over to stop his truck and exit the breathing section of road, but his steering wouldn't respond. The truck continued forward at a steady 50 miles per hour, driving itself, keeping Michael on the breathing road that was slowly suffocating him through enforced synchronization. Michael's vision tunneled, consciousness fading, his body shutting down from oxygen deprivation while his lungs continued their enforced 15-second breathing cycles. Michael passed out, his last awareness being the sensation of breathing in sync with the road, his body moving with the pavement's undulations, his consciousness dissolving into darkness. Michael woke gasping approximately 10 minutes later, his body desperately inhaling rapid, shallow breaths, recovering from the hypoxia. Michael's truck was pulled over on the shoulder, engine still running, no longer on the breathing section of road. Michael checked his GPS and saw he had traveled approximately 8 miles while unconscious, his truck driving itself through the breathing section and pulling over, safely once past it. Michael sat in his cab for over an hour, recovering from the oxygen deprivation and the terror of experiencing his breathing controlled by the road. Michael's body ached. His chest hurt from the enforced slow breathing. His head pounded from the hypoxia. When Michael felt capable of driving again, he continued north toward Atlanta, but he was shaken and confused, unable to understand what the breathing road was or why it had controlled his respiration. Michael researched Highway 59 after completing his delivery, looking for information about unusual road conditions or phenomena in Mississippi. Michael found scattered reports from other drivers describing similar experiences. Sections of highway that appeared to move or breathe, creating sensations of undulation and causing drowsiness or disorientation in drivers. Most reports attributed the phenomenon to heat mirages or fatigue-induced hallucinations, but a few drivers insisted the breathing was real and physical, that the road actually moved and affected drivers' bodies. Michael found one particularly detailed account from a driver named Patricia Chen, who had experienced the breathing road 3 years before Michael. Patricia described the same symptoms: enforced synchronization, slow 15-second breathing cycles, progressive hypoxia, loss of consciousness. But Patricia's account included additional information that Michael found terrifying. Patricia claimed the breathing road was alive, was a living organism that had grown into or merged with the highway pavement, that used the enforced breathing synchronization to feed on drivers, to extract something from their breath or their blood oxygen, to sustain itself through parasitic relationship with travelers. Patricia's theory was that the breathing road was a form of fungus or mold that had colonized the asphalt, that grew in the hot, humid conditions of Mississippi summers, that developed the ability to create movement and to synchronize drivers' breathing to facilitate feeding. The slow 15-second cycles created hypoxia in drivers, and during the oxygen-deprived state, the fungus extracted nutrients or energy from their bodies through mechanisms Patricia couldn't identify but had definitely experienced. Michael contacted Patricia, comparing their experiences, confirming details matched precisely. Both had experienced the breathing road on Highway 59 in Mississippi. Both had been synchronized to 15-second breathing cycles. Both had lost consciousness from hypoxia. Both had woken up past the breathing section with their trucks pulled over safely. Patricia told Michael something else that made his blood run cold. She had experienced the breathing road multiple times, returning to the same section repeatedly. And each time the synchronization was stronger, the hypoxia more severe, the road's control more complete. "It's marking us," Patricia explained, her voice tense with fear. "Once you breathe with the road, it knows you, remembers you, pulls you back. I've tried avoiding Highway 59 completely, but somehow I keep ending up there, routed through that section, experiencing the breathing again. And each time it's worse, each time the road takes more from me, drains more of my energy or life force or whatever it's feeding on. I've lost weight, lost strength, lost vitality. The road is slowly consuming me through repeated feedings." Michael felt terror settling into his chest as he processed Patricia's words. The breathing road wasn't a one-time phenomenon, but was an ongoing threat, a parasitic organism that marked drivers and repeatedly fed on them, draining their vitality through enforced breathing synchronization and hypoxia. And once marked, drivers were drawn back to the breathing section, unable to avoid it, compelled to return and feed the road again. Michael tried to never drive Highway 59 again, requesting routes that avoided Mississippi entirely, adding hours to his journeys to circumvent the state. But 3 months after his first encounter, Michael found himself on Highway 59 again despite his precautions. His GPS had routed him through Mississippi, claiming it was the fastest route, and Michael had followed without questioning until he was already on Highway 59, approaching the breathing section. Michael tried to take an early exit to leave Highway 59 before reaching the breathing road, but every exit he approached was closed or blocked, barriers indicating construction or road damage. Michael was trapped on Highway 59, unable to exit, being funneled toward the breathing section that was waiting to feed on him again. When Michael's truck reached the breathing pavement, the synchronization happened immediately. Michael's respiration matching the road's 15-second cycles before he even consciously registered the movement. This time, the hypoxia was more severe. Michael losing consciousness within 3 minutes instead of 10, his body more quickly drained by the road's feeding. Michael woke 20 minutes later past the breathing section, his body weak and trembling, his energy noticeably diminished. Michael looked in his truck's mirror and saw he appeared gaunt, his face thinner, his skin grayer, as if he had aged years in the 20 minutes of being fed upon. The pattern repeated every 3 months, Michael finding himself on Highway 59 despite his best efforts to avoid it, experiencing the breathing road, losing consciousness, waking up weaker and older looking. After 5 feedings over 15 months, Michael was hospitalized for severe malnutrition and exhaustion despite eating normally and getting adequate rest. Doctors couldn't explain his deterioration, couldn't identify any disease or condition that would cause his progressive weakness. Michael knew the breathing road was killing him slowly, feeding on his life force or vitality through repeated enforced synchronization, draining him with each encounter until he would eventually die from complete depletion. Michael tried to warn the medical community to explain about the parasitic road organism, but doctors dismissed his claims as delusions related to his physical condition. Michael was referred to psychiatric care, but no medication or therapy could protect him from being drawn back to Highway 59 every 3 months. Patricia Chen was found dead in her truck on Highway 59 in Mississippi 3 months after Michael's hospitalization. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but her body showed signs of extreme malnourishment and dehydration despite having eaten and drunk adequately. Patricia's truck was parked on the shoulder directly past the breathing section of road, pulled over safely after the final feeding that had drained the last of her vitality. Michael Torres died 4 months after Patricia, also found in his truck on Highway 59, also past the breathing section, also exhibiting unexplained malnutrition and dehydration. The breathing road had claimed both drivers through repeated feedings, marked them during their first encounters and drawn them back periodically to drain more of their life force, feeding until nothing remained, and the drivers died in their trucks on the shoulder past the breathing section, their bodies preserved briefly by the air conditioning before being discovered by highway patrol. And the breathing road continues existing on Highway 59 in Mississippi, a living organism colonizing the pavement, creating rhythmic undulations, enforcing synchronization with drivers who cross it, marking them during the first encounter and drawing them back repeatedly to feed again, slowly draining vitality through hypoxia and enforced breathing patterns, creating populations of marked drivers who will return periodically until the road has consumed them completely, until they die on the shoulder past the breathing section, until their trucks are found with their bodies exhibiting signs of depletion that medical science cannot explain. victims of a parasitic road organism that grows in hot, humid conditions and feeds on travelers who breathe with its rhythm, who synchronize with its 15-second cycles, who lose consciousness from hypoxia while the road extracts nutrients or energy or life force from their oxygen-deprived bodies, feeding methodically and patiently, marking drivers for repeated visits, drawing them back every 3 months regardless of their precautions, compelling them to return and breathe with the road again, to feed the pavement again, to lose more vitality with each encounter until the accumulation of feedings proves fatal, and another driver dies on Highway 59 past the breathing section, another victim of the road that breathes and feeds and marks and kills, the living pavement that colonizes highways and consumes travelers one breath at a time, one synchronization at a time, one feeding at a time. The road that breathes, continuing to grow and spread and expand its territory, creating longer sections of breathing pavement that more drivers encounter and become marked by, building populations of victims who will return periodically to feed the road until death releases them, until their vitality is completely drained, until they become the latest bodies found in trucks on shoulders past breathing sections on highways across Mississippi and potentially beyond. Wherever the parasitic organism has spread, wherever hot, humid conditions allow it to colonize asphalt and create breathing pavement that synchronizes drivers and feeds on their hypoxia. The road that breathes, growing stronger with each feeding, expanding with each victim, spreading along highways that become progressively more dangerous as more pavement becomes colonized and more drivers become marked and more feedings occur that strengthen the organism and allow further growth. The road that breathes becoming a highway-scale threat, a parasitic ecosystem that transforms pavement into living predatory surface that breathes and feeds and kills, claiming drivers who thought they were crossing inert infrastructure but discovered too late they were crossing a living organism that would mark them and drain them and eventually kill them through repeated and forced synchronization with breathing patterns incompatible with human survival. The road that breathes, claiming Michael Torres and Patricia Chen and dozens or hundreds of others whose deaths on Highway 59 were attributed to natural causes but were actually feeding outcomes, parasitic relationships terminated by complete consumption. The road satisfied until 3 months later, when the marked drivers would have returned for the next feeding if they had survived the previous one. The road waiting patiently for the next unmarked driver to cross the breathing section and become synchronized and marked and drawn into the feeding cycle that would repeat every 3 months until death ended the pattern. The road that breathes, perpetuating itself through consuming drivers, growing through feeding, expanding through killing, colonizing highways one section at a time, creating breathing pavement that will synchronize and feed and mark and drain and kill travelers forever as long as hot, humid conditions persist. And asphalt provides substrate for the organism to colonize, and drivers continue crossing sections that breathe and move and feed on those who synchronize with the 15-second cycles that slowly suffocate humans while feeding the road. Story 10. The Last Mile Home. Daniel Wright had been a long-haul trucker for 27 years, the final year of a career spanning nearly 3 decades. On December 19, 2019, Daniel was making his final delivery before retirement, hauling holiday goods from Chicago to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, a fitting conclusion to his career that would allow him to retire in the city where he had been born. His truck was a 2012 Freightliner Cascadia with 150,000 miles on the odometer, the vehicle that had carried Daniel through the majority of his career. The winter evening was cold, temperature near freezing, with light snow falling that created a peaceful atmosphere as Daniel drove south toward home. Daniel was euphoric, his mind focused on retirement, on the life he would build away from the road, on the hobbies and relationships he would finally have time to pursue. Daniel's wife had died 3 years earlier, but his children lived near Springfield, and Daniel looked forward to being present for his grandchildren's lives in ways his career had never allowed. Just one more delivery. Just 90 miles to Springfield. Just one final run to complete 27 years of driving. As Daniel approached Springfield following roads he had known since childhood, he noticed his GPS was showing an unexpected route to the delivery location. Instead of the direct path Daniel knew existed, the GPS was directing him through rural areas, along back roads and farm routes that would add significant distance to the journey. Daniel assumed the GPS was routing around construction or traffic, but when he checked traffic reports, there were no obstacles on the direct route, no reason for the detour. Daniel decided to ignore the GPS and follow the direct route he knew. But as he tried to turn onto the correct road, he found it blocked by a barrier indicating closure. No signs of construction or explanation for why the road was closed. Daniel reversed and followed the GPS's detour routing, assuming official information he lacked must justify the closure and alternate route. The GPS guided Daniel onto progressively smaller roads, from state highways to county roads to unnamed rural routes, leading him deeper into the countryside surrounding Springfield. After an hour of following the GPS through the rural detour, Daniel realized he should have reached Springfield long ago, that even the alternate route shouldn't take this long to cover 90 miles. Daniel checked his odometer and saw he had driven over 150 miles since leaving the highway, far more than the distance to Springfield should require. The GPS still showed him approaching the delivery location, but the estimated arrival kept increasing, the destination growing more distant despite Daniel driving continuously toward it. Daniel tried to turn around to backtrack and find the main highway, but every road he turned onto led in unexpected directions, curved in ways that didn't match Daniel's memory of the area's geography, created a maze that prevented Daniel from navigating back to known locations. Daniel's GPS showed his position moving erratically, jumping between disconnected points, creating a track that made no geographic sense, suggesting Daniel was driving through space that didn't connect normally. Night fell completely, darkness surrounding Daniel's truck, his headlights illuminating only the narrow rural road ahead. Daniel hadn't seen another vehicle or building for over an hour. The landscape completely empty and featureless, just flat snow-covered fields extending into darkness. Daniel's fuel gauge showed 3/4 full despite having driven over 200 miles, the consumption rate wrong, suggesting either his odometer was malfunctioning or fuel was being added somehow, neither explanation making sense. Daniel's phone rang, the screen showing a call from his daughter Emily. Daniel answered eagerly, hoping Emily could help navigate or provide information about road closures. But Emily's voice was panicked and confused. "Dad, where are you? We're at the delivery location waiting for you. You were supposed to arrive 3 hours ago. We've been calling and calling, but you didn't answer. Are you okay?" Daniel tried to explain about the detours and the rural roads and the strange navigation, but Emily insisted she had received Daniel's calls for the past 3 hours, that he had been answering and providing updates about his progress, that Daniel had claimed to be just minutes away multiple times but had never arrived. Daniel had made no such calls, had been driving silently through empty countryside, but Emily insisted she had spoken to him repeatedly and heard his voice and his explanations. "Dad, you keep calling us and saying you're almost there, saying you're on the last mile home, saying you can see Springfield, but then you call again 20 minutes later and say the same thing. We're worried. Something's wrong. Where are you really?" Emily's voice was thick with tears, her concern palpable. Daniel had no explanation, couldn't understand how he could have been calling his daughter while also driving silently through darkness. Couldn't reconcile the two contradictory accounts of the past 3 hours. Then Daniel saw lights ahead finally, after hours of empty darkness. A town appeared, buildings and streets and signs of civilization emerging from the rural emptiness. Daniel accelerated toward the town, relief flooding through him, thinking he had finally navigated through the maze and reached somewhere identifiable. But as Daniel entered the town, he saw a sign that made his heart stop. "Welcome to Springfield, Illinois." Daniel had reached Springfield, his hometown, the destination he had been driving toward for hours. But something was wrong with Springfield. The buildings looked older, architectural styles from decades past. Cars parked on streets were vintage models from the 1960s and 1970s, the town appearing as it had looked when Daniel was a child rather than as it existed in 2019. Daniel drove down Main Street and saw businesses that had closed before Daniel became a trucker. People dressed in outdated clothing. The entire town existing in a state from Daniel's past. Daniel stopped his truck in the middle of Main Street, climbed down from the cab and approached a pedestrian, an elderly man wearing a heavy coat. "Excuse me, what year is this?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking. The man looked at Daniel with confusion and concern. "It's 1970, son. Are you feeling all right?" Daniel backed away, his mind refusing to process what he was hearing. 1970, the year Daniel had turned 15, nearly 50 years in the past, impossibly distant from the 2019 Daniel had been driving through hours earlier. Daniel climbed back into his truck and tried his phone, but it showed no signal, no network, the technology incompatible with 1970 or simply unable to function in whatever state Daniel had entered. Daniel drove through Springfield's 1970 incarnation, seeing his childhood town as it had existed when he was young. Recognizing buildings and landmarks from his memories, but finding them preserved in forms that no longer existed in the real 2019 Springfield. Daniel saw his childhood home, the house where he had lived with his parents and siblings, looking exactly as it had in 1970, maintained and occupied, lights on inside suggesting the family was home. Daniel stopped his truck across the street and watched the house, and through the living room window he saw movement. His family, his parents who had died decades ago, his siblings as children, and himself, 15-year-old Daniel Wright, sitting at the dinner table with his family living in 1970, while 62-year-old Daniel watched from 2019 or whatever year he actually existed in. Daniel understood finally what had happened. The last mile home hadn't led him to 2019 Springfield, but to the Springfield of his youth, to the town as it had existed when he still lived there before he became a trucker, before he spent 27 years driving away from home. The last mile home had taken Daniel back through time, or had created a pocket where his past still existed, allowing him to see what he had left behind when he chose the road over staying in Springfield. Daniel's phone rang again, Emily calling, her voice desperate. "Dad, please, tell us where you are. We need to find you. You've been calling for 6 hours now, saying you're on the last mile, saying you can see home, but you never arrive. Please, Dad, we're so scared. Come home, please come home." Daniel tried to respond, tried to tell Emily he was in 1970 Springfield, tried to explain what had happened, but his voice wouldn't work, wouldn't transmit through the phone, couldn't cross the decades or dimensions that separated him from his daughter. Daniel drove through 1970 Springfield for hours, the town looping, streets connecting in patterns that brought Daniel back to the same locations repeatedly. Daniel was trapped in his past, in the last mile home that never ended, that kept showing him what he had left behind, what he had sacrificed for his trucking career, the family and town and life he could have had if he hadn't spent 27 years driving away from Springfield. The last mile home was his punishment or his prison or perhaps his reward, depending on perspective, showing him the past he had abandoned, letting him see his family as they had been, allowing him to witness the life he hadn't lived. Daniel's truck was found 3 days later on a rural road outside Springfield, engine running, fuel tank full, driver's seat empty. No signs of Daniel were found, no footprints in the snow, no indication where he had gone or how he had exited the truck. His phone records showed dozens of calls to his daughter made during the 3 days, all from Daniel's phone, all claiming he was almost home on the last mile, could see Springfield, would arrive in minutes. But Daniel never arrived, never came home. Disappeared somewhere between leaving Chicago and reaching Springfield, lost in the last mile that never ended. Daniel's family held a memorial service without a body, marking Daniel's disappearance as his retirement, acknowledging that he had spent his last moments trying to come home, calling to say he was almost there on the final mile of his final delivery. Daniel's daughter Emily continued receiving calls occasionally, always on December 19th, the anniversary of Daniel's disappearance. Calls showing Daniel's number, Daniel's voice saying he's almost home. Just one more mile, can see Springfield now, will arrive in minutes. The calls coming from wherever Daniel exists now, trapped in the last mile home that never ends, driving through 1970 Springfield eternally, seeing his family through windows, watching his childhood self living the life he left behind, experiencing the last mile stretched into infinity, the final delivery that never completes, the retirement that never arrives, just driving forever through the town of his youth, past his childhood home, seeing his family as they were 50 years ago, calling his daughter to say he's almost there, almost home on the last mile, will arrive soon, just need to drive a little further, just need to navigate one more turn, just need to complete the final delivery and he'll be home. He'll retire. He'll spend time with grandchildren. He'll build the life he planned. Just one more mile, always one more mile. The last mile home stretching forever through decades and dimensions, keeping Daniel Wright driving through Springfield eternally. Trapped between 1970 and 2019, between past and present, between leaving and arriving. The last mile never ending because home is a destination that exists in time as well as space. And Daniel is trying to reach a home that exists in a time he can no longer access, trying to complete a journey that spans 50 years compressed into one impossible mile. The last mile home that every trucker fears, the final delivery that never ends, the retirement that never begins, just driving forever through the town you left, seeing the life you didn't live, calling loved ones to say you're almost there, always almost there. Eternally on the last mile home that stretches infinitely between where you are and where you're trying to be. The career that never ends because the final run never completes. The delivery that remains pending forever. Daniel Wright driving his truck through 1970 Springfield in 2019, existing in both times simultaneously. Trapped in the last mile home where all truckers eventually arrive when their careers should end but instead continue forever. Driving past the finish line that recedes with each approach, chasing retirement that remains always 1 mile away, calling to say I'm almost home. Just one more mile, can see it now, will arrive soon. The words echoing through decades, transmitted from wherever Daniel exists. The last mile home, keeping him driving, keeping him calling, keeping him trying to complete the journey that can never complete. Because home is where you were, not where you're going. Home is the past you left behind, and the last mile home takes you back there but won't let you arrive, won't let you stop, won't let you park and climb down and walk through the door, just keeps you driving past it, seeing it, calling to say you're almost there. The last mile home that is the final truth of long-haul trucking. The destination that every driver eventually reaches but no driver ever arrives at. The mile that never ends. The home that remains always visible and always unreachable. The last mile stretching into eternity for Daniel Wright and for all truckers who spend their lives driving away from home only to spend their deaths driving toward it, trapped in the last mile that never ends. The final delivery that remains forever pending. The retirement that never arrives, just driving and calling and driving and calling, always on the last mile home.